Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. In this episode, I had the delightful opportunity to have a discussion with the journalist Katherine Brodsky, whose career as a media journalist evolved until one point when she was moderating an online media group and defended someone who'd made a point that was quite innocuous, but who had been attacked vociferously by online mobs. And of course, she was subsequently attacked. And that motivated her to think about other people's experiences and ultimately write this book, No Apologies: How to Find and Free Your Voice in an Age of Outrage. It's a fascinating book that is not quite what you think. It's a series of stories of people who've responded in many different ways with many different experiences, from someone who ran a knitting group and who was attacked, which you would imagine would be impossible to find something controversial about knitting in such a way, to a young black man who spent a lot of time talking to KKK members and helping them basically come out from their experience. Many, many different experiences, from anger and frustration to forgiveness, and talking about the different ways to deal with this unfortunate phenomenon. And it's as I say, it's an uplifting discussion. She's a wonderful writer and a very eloquent speaker, and I really had a good time talking to Katherine. We talked about her own background as a journalist, and one of the things that's fascinating about her, you'd never know from listening to her, is that she actually grew up in the Soviet Union, and her family were Jewish emigres from the Soviet Union. And like many of my colleagues I know from the former Soviet Union, her family and her are particularly sensitive to issues of dissent and suppression, which may be one of the reasons she became sensitized and wrote the book. It's a very interesting and, as I say, pleasant discussion. I hope you really enjoy it. You can watch it ad-free on our Critical Mass Substack site, and if you subscribe to that site, the dues you pay will go directly to supporting the Origins Project Foundation, the nonprofit that supports this podcast and other efforts to connect science and culture and reach out to people. Or you can watch it on, or listen to it on any YouTube listening site, or watch it later on our YouTube channel, which I hope you also consider subscribing to. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope you'll consider supporting the Origins Project Foundation as well. Thanks. Well, Katherine Brodsky, thanks for making time to come on the podcast. It's really great to talk to you. I've enjoyed reading.
Thanks for having me.
It's great, and I want to learn more about you. And one of the things that we do in this Origins podcast, and I like to do before talking about where people are, is talking about how they got to where they are. And I was trying to research your background, and it wasn't easy. Which maybe you should feel blessed that you can't find much information about you online about your background. And
Sure.
I tried to stalk you online, but I couldn't. I know that you were been a writer for Variety and covered culture and TV and all things like that. Although obviously interested in much broader topics, and came to write the book that we'll talk about, which I might as well show now. No Apologies. About how to find and free your voice in the age of outrage. And I want to, it's clear what caused you to write this book, so we'll get there. But I want to find more about your background. You said you're from your parents are from the Soviet Union. You were also born there, or?
Yeah, I was actually born there. So in the Soviet Union, right around the time that, it was collapsing, but hasn't quite collapsed. But, being Jewish, we were trying to get out. And so we managed to get out. We're intended to go to the US. And, there was some bribery involved, and that didn't quite work out. Not bribery on our end, the bribery to take, spot. And so ended up actually in Israel, where, in the middle of the Gulf War. So I was quite young. The part in the Soviet Union that I was born in was in the Ukrainian part of it
Wow.
nowadays.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm now like in the middle of two geopolitical crises and have taken pretty strong positions on them too. So
Well, maybe we'll
that
talk about those. I mean, having experienced those, and I will say that when I learned you're from the Soviet Union, a lot came together. When as you may or may not be aware, I've written about a lot of about issues, some of which we'll raise in this discussion. You talked about in your book, the issues of free speech and open inquiry, and also um, social justice religions. But some of my colleagues who've also agreed to write and speak out, and not many have, a number of them are from the Soviet Union or from former
oh,
Soviet
interesting.
Union because they experienced, and they've all written that way. Anna Krylov, Sergei Kleinerman, a mathematician, Anna Krylov's a chemist. Um, uh, they experienced things, and they write about how what they're seeing now reminds them of that, and they having experienced it once, they don't want to let it happen again without speaking out. And it's interesting to see people who have have seen things happen that many people here say could never happen here. Uh,
Yeah, and in my case, obviously I was still fairly young when I grew up there. So I was still a child. So part of that is not necessarily based on entirely my own memory, but growing up in the household, of my
Exactly.
family where they constantly talked about it. And being the rebellious teenager that I was at the time, it was like, Mom and Dad, you're like over the top. This could never happen here. What are you talking about? But at the same time, I did listen to them. It didn't kind of go in one ear and came out the other. I definitely listened to them. And, we definitely had a lot of disagreements. And then it pains me to say that I had to apologize to my parents, even though my book is called No Apologies, but I do believe in apologizing when you're wrong.
Yeah.
And when I had to at one point say, you actually have a point. I am seeing what you're talking about. So they really made me, I think in general, I grew up as a much more of an outsider because being an immigrant and being an immigrant twice, having to learn different languages,
Well, let's step back there because
yeah,
you're English. You wouldn't know you're an immigrant if you
yeah.
want to say that. I don't know whether that's a nice thing to say or not. But your first language was Russian, or I mean, was it
Yeah,
Russian?
Russian. Yeah, I spoke
And then you
Russian at
had
the
to learn
time.
Hebrew.
Yes.
And English, was English the third, or did you learn English all along that?
No, English was my third. And
Holy mackerel.
I was very lucky I had a good ear at the time. So it's funny, my parents told me that my teachers in was it grade 8, grade 7? They kind of took me aside because they made me do, maybe because I was an odd kid, they made me do all these tests. So they made me do sort of like an IQ test type thing. They made
Hmm.
me do, a math test, and they made me do an English test. And on the math portion, I scored several grades ahead, but then on the English side, I was half a grade behind. And so they called my parents in and they're so concerned. They're like, we don't understand. She's doing so well in math, but she's, half a grade behind in English. And my parents like, isn't that great? That's great.
Yeah.
And they're like, what are you talking about? They didn't realize at that point I'd only lived in the country for a year.
You
So
moved
they
to the
thought I was a
country in
native
grade.
speaker.
You
Yeah. So I
moved
was,
to the country at 12 or what?
yeah, I was 12. Yeah.
Holy mackerel. I mean, if you'd moved at 3 or 4, it'd be easy to understand, but 12 to speak so well without an accent and to learn and coming to school, of course, I speak French, but I never had to be thrust into an environment where I suddenly had to learn in a new language. Of course, it's the best way to learn. I've seen it happen from my
It
kids
is
at
the
various
best
times.
way to learn. That's why I struggle. Like I tried to learn, well, French, in
Yeah,
school. My
yeah,
French is comme ci, comme ça. And
yeah.
then my Spanish, which I took in university, I struggled. I was probably the worst student in that class. I'm just not good at learning languages anymore, but I was, I guess, luckily Well, I had this whole thing. I had a nearly photographic memory growing
Mm.
up, and now I have like the worst memory. So something happened.
You
I
you
lost
filled
it
up
all.
your head and now
I
it's
I
full.
did. That actually probably is exactly what happened because it was around when I started university and you're doing so much reading
Yeah.
that I started noticing, oh, something is going on with my brain where I'm like forgetting things.
Well, I think learning as a child, it's great to learn many languages as a child, and I think it's a gift, and I wish more people had that opportunity. It was forced upon you. But but now I'm intrigued, and I was going to get there anyway. I always ask people why they're not scientists, but I want, and because why would you want to be anything else? But but you were good in math, okay? So what did you study in university? Because I couldn't find any of this stuff. So
No, I studied communications. I have a bachelor's of applied science, close
applied.
enough, I guess. Well, I had it. So I remember taking physics in high school, and I took also biology. And I dropped out of the biology class because I just struggled because to me it was just memorizing things, and
It
I
was to
didn't
me
find
too,
that
and
it.
I'm much older than you, and it was all memorizing. Yeah.
Okay, so that's where it was. And then physics I liked. I actually enjoyed it because I found that it applied to the world around me and it made logical sense. So I actually liked it. And when I applied myself, I was pretty good at it. It's interesting because I've been rethinking my life choices a bit. I was an extreme capitalist
Uh-huh.
because I was an immigrant. It was that
Uh-huh.
mindset at the time. And I was like, I'm just going to be a millionaire. I'm going to make all these companies. And then I started writing, and it wasn't the plan. It really wasn't the plan.
Mhm.
Now, when I look back at it, it's funny because I actually would have chosen to be a neuroscientist,
Ah,
just because I'm really interested in that side of things
sure.
nowadays. But that's not where my head was at the time. So.
Well, let's see. Before we fully leave where your head was at the time, um, uh, I'm intrigued. What your parents emigrated? They were Jews from Soviet Union. What did your dad do and your mom do? What were your sort of role models and yeah, when you were
Well,
younger?
my mom was a biochemist,
Ah,
and my dad, he was so his degree would have been in physics, but later on when he moved, he basically taught himself how to code, and so he got into the computer side of things. And he
I
also
see.
worked as a engineer at some points, yeah.
So you have two scientist parents. So there's now no
I
excuse
do.
for you not to become a scientist. I went,
I
did
do.
they encourage you or did they just say do whatever you want? I mean,
Oh no, they wanted me like to be a
a
doctor or,
doctor, of course.
yeah, of course. Yeah. Like, well, my dad taught us how to code. We sat in the basement. I have a couple of siblings, but
Uh-huh.
I was the first victim. He made me do math theorems. So it's funny because I'd be like, there's no way I can do this proof. And I'd be like crying, why are you forcing me to do this? And then he'd say, I'll give you $20 if you solve this. And it's incredible how quickly I would then solve it. So so it was pretty funny. But I think it's good. I mean, part of why I was better at math at the time was certainly because my dad did spend time with me on
Sure.
that, and he would get these old textbooks because he thought the new textbooks were really terrible, and they are. And because the problem with math, and I think why kids don't like math is because you learn how to solve. You just learn the formula, right? You
Yeah.
don't actually learn how you get there, and then it's boring, of course.
Yeah, and well, now of course there's a backlash because now getting the right answer is white supremacist. But
Oh,
we
yes, yes, that's right. Which I still don't quite understand it. I really don't understand it.
yeah, well,
But
that's
yeah, the
good. That
bigotry of low
indicates you understand
expectations.
it.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Um,
No, but I like what I do like about math is how precise you can be with it. There's something about it that like nowadays it's funny. If you told me years ago that I'd be just doing solving little puzzles for fun,
uh-huh.
that seems ridiculous, but I actually later on in life became more interested in just doing like logical puzzles, and I do IQ tests for fun just to like play with
Sure.
the yeah, yeah.
Well, that's great. So first your dad tortured you with math. And nowadays he'd be, be child abuse. But then math for
Yeah.
money. I've never heard that before. That's a great. But
Well, I told you I was a
yeah.
capitalist at the time.
But did you ever consider going and do math? And what you chose communication? Had you already started to write by that point, or
Yeah, so I published my first like article that I've been paid for when I was about 15 years old.
oh, who
And it
paid
was
for it?
like it was a magazine I wrote for. I don't even remember what it was called anymore, but I made $50, and to me at the
Wow.
time that was a fortune
Yeah.
because what are my other options? Folding clothes in stores, like, and I'm not very good at that, so nobody would hire me anyways. I was interested in talking to people actually. And as an interviewer, like a lot of the work that I've done in journalism is mostly interviewing people. And it was a good excuse to get to know people. And I can't be like, I'm just interested in you. Can we talk?
Yeah.
It's a little stalkerish
Yeah.
and creepy. But if I want to do an interview with someone, that's a perfect excuse. And then you get to learn about the world from the people who like designed it in essence. So I loved that. And I also created my own publication when I was 16. So the learn to code part played a role. Like I built a website and it
Ah,
became pretty popular. I had about, it's not bad for somebody to know what they were doing. It had about 600,000 visitors a month. So
wow, that's great.
yeah, yeah,
Wow. So you got the writing bug, and indeed you did. I noticed that your journalist career was mostly interviewing people, TV, business people,
yeah.
politicians, etc. So that's clearly. But you went to school then specifically because you knew you wanted to write did you think with communication, do you think of being like a TV interviewer or something like that, or was it always
I
writing?
never thought of it as TV. No, it's interesting because I started my own podcast recently, and it took me a little while to get into the habit of switching between, as an interviewer, I first of all, you can say anything you want to say if you're doing print, and you can embarrass yourself and all that because in the end, all I care about is getting the quotes from the person and making them
Mm.
feel comfortable. But then when you're on camera, that changes things. And then in the beginning, you can see like I was mostly asking questions, and now
Mhm.
I'm like commentating more and having more of a conversation. So that was a bit of a learning curve, I think.
Well, that's interesting. Many people would wish I moved in the opposite direction because I should say that my podcasts have always been, and when I do things on stage, they're always dialogues. They're not meant to be interviews, and some people don't. Every time, and it'll happen with this podcast. They'll say, "Why are you talking when your guest should be talking?" But I'd like to
I
talk
saw
about
that, but
ideas.
I like that.
Oh, I do
Well, I
too, and
like it as a conversation.
I think
Yeah.
conversations are fascinating ultimately, and I think that, and it's a forum that I like to continue. Although I am working on listening and more, and I have been for
Well,
the last few years.
listening is important. And then the other thing that I found important that I, teach but don't always practice is the art, the power of the silence. So, it's a technique, but essentially it's going to make the person really uncomfortable if you allow that silence. But because they're uncomfortable, they're going to want to fill that silence and they'll say something that's real, but we want to be nice and help people out because it makes them feel uncomfortable. So you end up often filling that silence to avoid the discomfort. So it's something that because at some point I taught interviewing skills in journalism, and that was something I taught, but I also don't always practice.
It's look, I know that and you can see that if you watch a podcast I did with my late friend Cormac McCarthy, the last thing he did before he died, I guess, and the writer Cormac McCarthy, who was loquacious about, I mean, who basically even in the best days would usually answer a question with a yes or no and then just not say anything. But he was old that day, and I knew that for a variety of reasons that it was going to be hard to get things out of him. So I wanted to encourage him by presenting him things and having a discussion of things I knew he was interested in. But of course, a lot of it was filling the silence. And you're right. On the other hand, there's a filmmaker, a friend of mine you probably know, Werner Herzog, maybe, but
Oh, yes.
who I've done the podcast with. But he does a great job when he's filming. He often keeps the camera rolling after the question. Just it tells you, sometimes just to see how people react, and it's so yeah, and he keeps that in the movie. It's often interesting to see that. I remember at first, it's a fascinating thing to just sort of let people think about what they said and if they want to add anything, and not fill the silence.
Yeah, it's true. And I think sometimes, well, you don't always express yourself exactly the way you meant to, and then later you're kicking yourself. And I think there's a lot to interviewing that's psychological. I mean, part of why I was drawn to it, and I was very interested. So I guess it's not true that neuroscience was something that I got an interest in later in life, because actually, now that I think about it, I used to read books about how the brain works just for
Hmm.
fun, and psychology books. I also read interrogation books, interrogation technique books, because of the interviewing side of things.
Oh,
Because
I
every
see.
person is their own unique individual and how they talk and their style. I just interviewed Elon Musk last week, and just learned a lot about that from, because it's a little bit of a, the way he answers questions isn't how people normally answer
Yeah, yeah.
questions.
I mean,
So
I've never interviewed him online, but I've met with him a wide variety of times, and having a conversation with Elon is interesting and difficult at best. So yeah.
yes, that's, I would characterize that. And he was pretty, I mean, he was good faith with me, but but it's definitely like, I realize that the question has to be maybe far more specific,
Mm.
far more just direct, not specific, direct. Um, but even then, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that it would work the way that I wanted to work.
Well, speaking of things, of saying things you didn't intend or not, or unexpected consequences, it's a good time to now talk about what got you to this point, to this book. And why don't you talk about what happened to you, and
Yeah.
as a preface.
Sure. Well, as a journalist, I was involved, and there was a group for women that was a larger group, and I made an offshoot of that group. And that group was for jobs, for women working in media and just jobs. And we had mentorship in there, which was actually featured in the New York Times. And I don't think that would happen again.
Yeah.
But it was, and we had some resources, but predominantly it was just jobs. It wasn't
Mm.
like personal conversations. And then one day somebody posted a job opportunity at Fox News. And she was even kind of apologetic about it. We're trying to diversify it, et cetera, et cetera. But people just started attacking her like crazy. And I felt like, since it was my group, it was my duty to chime in. And
Mm.
so I did. And I said what I thought was a pretty neutral post. And I said, listen, like, let's stay away from personal attacks. And also, let's stay away from politics in this group and just focus on jobs, which is what this group is about. And, we've come apart so much over the last few years. Let's just come together. And I did not anticipate. Like, it's funny because when I tell the story to other people now, I usually can tell by their reaction. They know exactly what's coming and would have expected me to, but I really did not know that was going to come. So people just started calling me a white supremacist, a KKK sympathizer, that I would just as soon allow the KKK to recruit from my job board. And just, it was a massive pylon, made worse because at one point they said, well, you can't take politics out of it because this is a group for women and therefore it is inherently political. And
Mm.
I said, well, and at that point, that, I didn't know I'd get some backlash, but I said, okay, then I'll open it up to everyone.
Mhm.
But I thought I was being fair because I said I'll give people a month if they wanted to leave the group, if they wanted to create a new group like this one. And even I was even willing to give up my name of the
Mm.
group and
Mhm.
promote their new group. But that actually, then everything exploded even more. So people started harassing me on social media, trying to reach out to my employers, past editors, so that they wouldn't hire me again, attempted doxing, sending me, things like, well, the one that really stood out for me, so I keep referring to that one, is literally somebody sent me an image of a mob with pitchforks. And it just said something like, we have long memories. And it was just so insane. I've never experienced anything in my life like that. And at the same time, I was also getting messages from people that were messages of support. And they said, I'm
My dog is
so
supporting
sorry.
you right now. My dog is very
Oh,
angry
I
at the
love
mob.
it. I appreciate your dog support. I will I love that.
Anyway, but my dog supported you as we last said, and you got some letters of support, but you got these pitchforks, and go on from there.
Yeah, well, the letters of support were interesting because they tended to go a very similar way every time I get it. It would say something like, "I see what's happening to you, and it's wrong, but and you're right in this situation. However, I feel very ashamed, but I'm too afraid to stand up for you." I was getting a lot of those, and they pretty much said the same word for word.
Uh-huh.
And then I was also getting messages from people who've experienced similar things that, in their case, some people have lost their jobs, their entire careers, whose lives have been destroyed. And so that's where I felt like a certain responsibility to speak out. And I ended up writing, the first thing I did was in the book. The first thing I did was writing that Newsweek article.
Yeah.
And at the time, I genuinely thought that my life will be just completely destroyed. At least my career would be destroyed because
Uh-huh.
now the fire was starting to die out a little bit at that
Uh,
time. So I
Uh-huh.
thought, because people don't have long attention spans.
Yeah.
Um, and there was an article that came out before that Newman Labs did as well. I think that's Harvard's paper, but
Yeah.
that was, pretty accurate recollection of what had happened. So the facts I think were on my side. And but I thought, I have to speak about this intolerance culture that I was seeing because people, you don't have to like Fox News to not attack somebody for
Mm.
posting a job there, right? And then you have this kind of discourse that's completely tainted by people's emotions and hatred of each other and bad faith. And as a result, you have ideas not being challenged in any way because you have a culture of fear. So bad ideas can very easily win because there's no challenge to it. And people are just not having conversations in good faith where they disagree with each other. And I was seeing that in the culture before all of this happened to me
Yeah, of
too. I
course.
mean, I was already slowly approaching like trying to use my voice, but it was much more, I wasn't a public person at all at the time, aside of
Yeah.
my journalism. But I would speak to people individually, and I would find that a lot of people actually did agree, but they would only do that once I brought it up, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. At the beginning of the book, you say you, like many, I had deep concerns about the way words are being twisted and identities were being weaponized, but I kept my concerns hidden and unexpressed. But then
Yeah.
you say, um, it's become clear to me that this choice to be silent is costing society a great deal. And I'll just read a paragraph because I think it's interesting. It says, "My story is just one of many cautionary tales of what happens when we allow the few to speak for the many. In the end, only 2% of members left your Facebook group when you refused to step down, and yet the noise they made prior to their departure, in contrast to the silence of the rest of the members, made it impossible to discern the truth of what the majority believed. This was a key insight for me in this episode. When the majority remains silent, a very vocal minority can easily gain complete control of a group, even if its views are wildly unpopular. Indeed, this phenomenon not only accounts for many dark moments in history, but also explains much about what's happening in our society today. So clearly the concern about remaining silent was what motivated you to not just write that article, but eventually write the book. And what I'd like to do, I'd actually like to go through things because I mean, what the book is a is a is a description of 13 or 14, I forget how many case studies,
Mm.
one of those numbers, maybe 16. We'll get
15, 16, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and because I wrote numbers down, I think I went up to 16 somewhere, and of very different case studies, each of which illuminates something interesting. And as someone who's experienced a lot of things myself, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what's going on. But the first chapter in the book is your discussion, which quite factual and interesting about the notion of a silenced majority, and I want to spend a little while on that. Um, um, so I think what I'm gonna do is I was just thinking of um so you talk about, things happening gradually, and you say, okay, soon harmless requests and rules are introduced. You're told not to wear a certain dress or hairstyle. because it's cultural appropriation. You're told the word man includes everyone who self-identifies as one. You're told that only white people can be racist, and you're told you must believe all women. They must never question the lived experience of anyone from an underrepresented minority. Because having said all that, now we pushed a lot of buttons, and already we'll get a
I
lot of
know.
hate for all of that. But I think what you point out is that these things. I mean, the first thing you point out is that in a lot of countries, Canada, where both you and I are right now, and the UK, things are really actually kind of scary. Just not those simple cultural pressures are turning into legalistic pressures. And
Exactly.
let me just quote this, and then I'm going to ask you to comment. But there's some things I really that really hit me. You said some I love facts, and I like that there's statistics and facts at the beginning of this book. Um, uh, 17% of American adults, 44 million, agree with the following statement. Use of force is justified to ensure members of Congress and other government officials do the right thing. I mean, I'm just shocked at that. Um, Use of force to ensure that they do the right thing, of course, without saying what the right thing is. The right thing is always what you want them to do. But
Yes.
but the notion in the democracy that almost 20% of the public is willing to use force to constrain elected officials to do what they want is
That was one of the
terrifying, don't
most
you think?
shocking statistics I've come across. I came across that one, a little while ago, and I was very, very stunned by that number. Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying when you think of the context of the coming election in the US. If people are willing to, 20% of the population thinks that Congress should, you should use force on Congress, which some large number of people thought on 2000 in 2020. Um,
Yeah.
and we're willing to take action on that. It's very concerning. In Canada, since moving to Canada, which I did a few years ago, of course, I'm more and more familiar with some of the things, but this the wokeness, or at least the notion to constrain language, has again become official. You talk about the Online Streaming Act. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah. I mean, the Online Streaming Act. Do
Bill
you want
one,
to
big
read?
C11. Yeah, I know, I know.
Yeah.
I'm don't want to.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
trying to quiz you, but I'll read what you wrote. It allows the government the power to
Yeah.
regulate online speech and shut down social media and streaming accounts of Canadians. It's it's
Yeah, I mean it it's 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 really interesting that especially in Canada we've gotten to that point at a place where there's no real pushback, and I think there's not even real knowledge that this is happening. Even like for example, nowadays you can't get news on, say, Facebook, right?
mm,
There's also legislation, and Facebook just sort of refused because they were trying to charge them money basically to pay for linking to other outlets. It's such a ridiculous thing, and there just wasn't much pushback. And then there is this attempt to pass a law where, where they deem certain things hate speech.
but is that law hasn't been? You talk about it. It's online
Yeah, it
harms
hasn't
bill.
passed yet. Yeah,
But they're
hasn't
attempting
passed
to,
yet.
yeah, to eh, um
But I accidentally
face
stumbled
criminal
across
charges.
that.
Was that?
Yeah, it wasn't something that is really talked about. I mean, that's the thing. I think a lot of the things that happen in Canada in terms of censorships, they just sort of slowly creep in, and they don't, like, there's just no pushback. And part of that, I imagine, is because, first of all, we have almost no media, right? And a lot
Mm,
of it is indeed sort of captured by government interests. But even within, like, I know there be journalists who are somewhat interested in covering these kinds of stories, and yet they don't really have the opportunity. And you have almost, I mean, and this is not like an ideological thing, like a lot of the very left leaning publications that I used to know that were very independent and did sort of hold some of the feet to the fire of the politicians, they're gone, or they have almost no
mhm.
resources. They've been stripped. So there's almost no media to like bring these things to attention. Now you have a situation where you can't share stories very easily, right? Because unless
Right.
you already subscribe to any of these entities, now you can't share that with your friends. So there's like a vacuum where the Canadian citizens don't really even know what's going on, and that there's these attempts. I reference a bill in Ireland that I
Mhm.
don't think has passed yet, but I think probably will. And that particular bill allows the government to fine you or imprison you merely for what they deem to be hate speech that you didn't share with anybody. You could be writing it in your journal, on your
Wow.
computer, and you have to provide access to your computer. So if you don't, you get fined, or I think potentially even imprisoned even for that offense. Those are like terrifying things,
Yeah,
and I
if you
don't
don't,
think they're getting much attention.
yeah, thoughts are supposed to be free, and if you write them down, they're still free. And and if you don't send them to anyone, and then if you do, they're still supposed to be free in a free society. But I was surprised. This hate bill, this in Canada defines hate as the bill defines as the emotion that involves detestation or vilification, and that is stronger than dislike or disdain. So if you
Well, and that's
suggest
the
that
thing.
anyone should be vilified or detested, maybe for good reasons, and it's really amazing.
Well, it's that's the thing. I mean, it's not that I'm like a fan of quote unquote hate speech, and there are certain things that I personally subjectively would consider hate speech, but that's the issue, that it is subjective. And we might get together as like pretty reasonable people and decide, yeah, saying this particular thing, or yeah, it's not good. It's we'd consider that hate speech. But then you also have groups of people getting together who are immensely unreasonable. And then in their view, hate speech is anything. I mean,
Is
I had somebody,
misgendering.
well, I had somebody get mad at me merely for it was a microaggression. I mispronounced her name. And
Okay.
there was a whole campaign for that, that this person started. Although, yeah, it's just you don't know. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder. And I have a hard time with names that had nothing to do with, her ethnic
Yeah.
background or anything like that. So that's the problem, because once we allow people to decide, we're allowing often again those fringe voices that I mentioned, like are the ones who get more, they're the more active voices. Like a lot
Yeah.
of people who are just more common sense human beings, they stay out of politics, they stay out of activism,
Hmm.
they don't get involved in these things, and therefore their voice doesn't really have much weight. So who gets the weight? It's generally the radical voices, the extremists, because they're very involved, and they use these bullying tactics. And like you mentioned, in my group, it was later that I realized, oh, it's only 2% or something like that that was actually actively offended by
Yeah.
this. And in the meantime, it felt at the time like everyone was against me except for the people who were sending me these messages of support. So there was no way to tell. And at the time, too, I have to say, because I have a people pleaser tendency,
Yeah.
I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong, right? Like I definitely struggled with that. I was like, maybe if so many people are telling me that I'm an evil person, like maybe I am doing something that's evil and I'm not understanding. And I
Yeah.
really spend time reflecting, and I would tell friends of mine the story, and I would make myself look more awful than I even was, just to get more of their honest perspective, because I didn't want to leave anything out. I didn't want to paint myself in a more positive light than it was. And it took me a long time to like come to the conclusion that I did. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. So I didn't apologize, right? Because
Mm-mm.
I didn't ultimately feel like I did do anything wrong. Because I'm stubborn about not admitting, I have no problem apologizing when
Mm.
I'm wrong. I have
Yeah.
zero problem with that.
Yeah.
I'm quick to do it. But when I don't feel, because it's not the truth, then I become very stubborn. And in that situation, these people, and I'll tell you what like really changed it around for me. And I guess I also mentioned that in the book, but it was a big, big lesson for me. It's like I looked at the people and I thought, how are they behaving? Like, would I ever behave that way? If I strongly disagreed with myself, what would I do? And do I respect those individuals who would behave in such an awful way, where they, bully and call names and accuse people and try to get, make sure that you can't make a living anymore? I mean, that is not a person that I respect. So why would I care what they think? I care what people I respect think. And that's where I've sort of arrived, and that changed everything for me. That's where I found my strength, because before that I had so much self-doubt.
Well, it's hard not to when you're being attacked, and have been someone who's seen this, been, when you're vilified publicly, and I've been that way too. It's hard. It's really no matter how tough you are, it's hard to, not begin to believe, even though even if it's a small group of very loud individuals, and it's great to do two things. As you just said, why, as Richard Feynman's father once said to him, "Why do you care what other people?" Or his wife, sorry, not his father. Why do you care what other people think in the first place? And realize who to respect and who not to respect. And when situations like this happen, you quickly realize who you should respect, but also
Yeah.
to realize that it's not that it's just a small group. Again, I know personally that in difficult times have been reassured when some very significant individuals, and I won't mention them now, but when they write you and say, you know what, there's a large number of people who aren't saying anything, and and they agree with you, and so it's really hard, and we'll see that in these stories, that it can be really hard on an individual and their close, their families if they have any, that people often don't realize how, or maybe they want to. I mean, they want to hurt people, but I don't think they realize how hurtful it can be. And
Yeah.
it's um, in any case, let me give one more. And by the way, but how hurtful it can be to object to speech. I will say personally, I don't think inciting violence is one thing, but the purpose of freedom of speech is to allow speech that you detest. And I don't think any, and there's a difference between saying I hate this person and saying Jews are X. But
Yeah.
even that, I'm in the extreme of thinking that ultimately people can show how stupid they are by being allowed to speak rather than
I
being
have
puzzled.
mixed feelings these days. I
Yeah,
think
I
my
know it's
mind
hard in the
has.
current times with what's going on.
Well,
Um,
it's a combination of things. So, in particular, so I would have considered myself a free speech absolutist. Now, I still do in terms of the legal side of things,
mhm.
but does it mean that you have to give, do you always have to provide a platform for someone yourself? Like, it's like, okay, if you're inviting people to a dinner party, are you gonna, necessarily want to invite somebody who's just, is an awful person? No. So I think you have the right to, now you can have conversations with people that you find their views abhorrent if there's a value to that conversation. And the value is either, well, you're going to potentially debunk it, or you learn something new about their perspective. Maybe you had it wrong, right?
Exactly. You learn, that's the whole point. It was and I learned it from Christopher Hitchens, who learned it from Hume. Um, that the the point of freedom of speech is not to give freedom to of the speaker, but freedom of the listener to learn that they may
Yes.
be wrong. And Christopher was a model for me in the sense, as a friend of mine. He could have conversations with people that I couldn't imagine being in the same room with. People thought him as a bulldog,
Yeah.
but on a personal level, he had friends from across the political spectrum.
And there's a difference too, where like you can talk, like one of the people in my book is Daryl Davis, who talks
Yeah.
to members of the KKK. Well, there's a difference. He would talk to them and have sort of friendships, and as a result, and he's a black man, right? Born in the civil rights
Mhm.
era. But these people, as they got to know him, they left the Klan, and some of them were like leaders. So it's crazy, but and it shows you what speech can do and engagement. But nobody owes that, and it's also different. It's not like he had them on his show and
Mhm.
he was like praising them and
Yeah.
singing and I think the one thing that has shifted for me in my understanding of free speech is this idea of like sunshine is the best disinfectant, because I think in the age of social media there is a problem with that, and that problem is that you don't always get to disinfect quite right. So on the one hand, for example, when, yeah, like I say, October, when anti-Semitism sort of became more prevalent, like I was seeing it because I was attacked frequently and I'm pretty good at ignoring it. Um, but I think people didn't understand the scale of it. And
Mhm.
now it is visible and they understand. They came back to me and they said, okay, we were wrong. We see the scale. So being able to see it and it's important because you can't address something you don't see. And that's something that
Yeah.
Daryl says in the book too. But also at the same time, you have this problem where some really insane rhetoric based, not rooted in fact, can spread very easily. And there isn't really a chance to give it that sunshine because, the people sort of stick together and it's easier for people who have these kind of views that are hateful to find each other. It's the same thing with conspiracy theorists, right? For conspiracy theorists, it's not that there's more people who are tending to think that way. It's just that it's much easier for them to find each other. So they build communities. And the problem with these communities is that it becomes very difficult to leave them because that becomes part of their identity, not even just the conspiracy theory that's holding them. And a good example of that are the flat earthers,
Hmm.
where essentially, I haven't seen that documentary myself, but somebody told me about a documentary where somebody actually realizes towards the end, it's like, actually, probably you're right that the world is round, but I've made all these friendships.
Hmm.
And it's like a cult. And I think all these things, I think a lot of this, by the way, comes down to cult-like thinking and indoctrination, but it's very difficult for people to leave their communities behind, and that keeps them trapped in these like
Well, that's
ridiculous
the source
beliefs.
of the longevity of religion. But anyway, we'll talk about that in another
Yeah.
another time. But uh, the let's I want to go to the case studies, but let me read one statistic which will tell you why, which will reinforce, at least reinforces for me, why one should be worried if one wasn't already. Because I know a lot of people say, oh, this is just some marginal thing, but here, look, let's look at the younger generation, which is being indoctrinated with this stuff. Students and young adults who've grown up with the idea that speech itself can be a form of violence, which it isn't, by the way. Speech is not a form of violence, in case people wonder. Sticks and stones. But words will
It
break
can
your arms, but word.
trigger. I'll make the devil's advocate
Yeah.
argument. I wrote about this in a little essay once upon a time, but speech being violent. So actually it could feel like violence because it actually can provoke similar reactions
Oh,
in the
sure.
body. The problem is speech is in the eye of the beholder. It's a highly
Exactly.
subjective thing. Yeah.
Yeah, same with offense, which we'll get to. Offense is in the eye of the beholder, and that's where it should stay. Anyway, the percentage, okay, in attitudes towards free speech seem to be shifting dramatically in the wrong direction among high school and college students. This is what's worrying them. According to a Pew Research poll, 62% of U.S. teens aged 13 to 17 say that they value others being able to feel welcome and safe online over individuals being able to freely speak their minds. This notion that somehow it's safety, because at the end, I will talk about later, feeling safe is being unsafe. But in 2022, a survey conducted by the Buckley Institute at Yale University found 41% of college students said they were in favor of using violence to stop hateful speech, a rise of 5% from 2021, and nearly half, 48%, agreed that sometimes speech can be so offensive that it merits the death penalty. This is what's amazing to me. And then, finally, in a 2023 survey from the Institute for Global Innovation and Growth at North Dakota State University, an alarming 76% of students said that they would report a professor for saying something offensive. That's the reason many of my colleagues who are still teaching are worried,
Yeah.
and I can understand that. Well, there was more I was going to go on to there, but I'd like to get to some of the stories and go on, sort of a little review of each one before we get to sort of some concluding remarks. And I want to put you on the spot something, because you actually pointed out something interesting, is that you in defense of the concern about open air being the best disinfectant, and saying, well, but it's hard because certain things, ideas get pervasive, and you got to do something about it. I want to come back to that. I want to hit you with it, because some of the people here, especially when we talk about COVID and other things, because you've got to balance one versus the other, and I want to have that discussion if we get there.
Yeah.
But let's start with Maria Tuskin, who and the moral of that. Each of these chapters begins with kind of a lesson, an object lesson from each person's experience, and this one is called "Build Your Own Community." So why don't you mention about what happened to Maria? Remarkable. When I
Yes.
first in the knitting community, you figure docile community.
I
But
find it
anyway,
like it wasn't funny what happened to her,
yeah,
but I found it funny that the knitting community would be in such an uproar
yeah,
over something like that. So in her case, what had happened was there was a woman who was heading on a trip to India, and she said, it feels like something like it feels like being in a different planet. I think
yeah,
that's some
yeah,
she said something along those lines, which, I've traveled a lot and certain places feel very different. I don't really see the offensive part, but people got incredibly offended and started,
this was,
going
by
out.
the way, not
Yeah.
an experience. Just to come back to this, she wasn't saying she experienced this. She said she was excited about it, and going to India was like being offered a seat on a flight to Mars, which is many people would think of as a positive thing. So she was so
Yeah.
excited. It's like being offered a seat a flight to Mars. It's so different from everything she's used to. An excited, wonderful comment, and boy, what happened?
Exactly. And it's like this, I guess they saw that as what making a different culture exotic, or it's like you can't be excited about it. Like cultures are different.
Yeah,
I come from different cultures myself. Like it's just such a, I don't think people in India would be offended, is what I'll say. And that's
yeah,
generally the case. It's people being offended on behalf of other people, and it's not serving the people of that culture. Anyways, she got, a huge pile on people. It became a huge scandal within the knitting community. And then Maria just felt like, this is wrong. And she felt like a moral obligation to say something. So she filmed a video and she kind
hmm,
of, stood up for this person. That person, by the way, did apologize. It was
oh,
Maria who did not.
yes,
Um, and then as a result, like she was completely taken out of the world of knitting, where, people didn't want to collaborate with her. They started campaigns against her. Her business, it was just such a horrific story over something that, I just don't get it in a way. And then at the end, and then she started sort of making fun of, she created a different yarn brand where she started making, fun of some of these woke things, the
yes.
terms.
She
Yeah. So
responded
that
by
was,
basically provoking further, which I found, which is my natural tendency too. So I was
yeah.
amused by it.
I don't know if it's my tendency, but I respect it,
Well,
and I think she did it with humor, which I think
yeah.
is one of the best ways to deal with something like that.
Almost everything is best dealt with humor, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But with her, like I think the reason that the key lesson is building your community is because ultimately she built her own community around her that was much smaller, but was a community that was more accepting of different perspectives, and wasn't about, just canceling people and going after their livelihoods. And she got more of a smaller but loyal base. Unfortunately, the story didn't, but I won't spoil it.
well, no, the story doesn't end well for a lot of people. The point is that it's not
Yeah.
as if these are all heroes whose lives have been great. I mean,
No.
there are consequences, but the point is that these people act, and yeah, she had to end her. You can tell this. Well, I don't know whether it's not a mystery book, so I don't know. But if you don't want to
It's
tell a
not it's
story,
not a mystery book. I mean, these stories are out there, but it's unfortunate because when I was fact checking the book, because I wrote it like, you would know how long it takes to get from writing and to publish date.
publishing,
So,
yeah.
yeah, so it took a while. And then as I was kind of going through the book and making sure things were still up to date, I found out that her business was shattered. So that was unfortunate because I was hoping that would have been like a nice victory story. And I think it's also important to note, you're right, like a lot of the stories, like the reason that some of these people are even in the book is like because I at some point have heard their story, was introduced to them. A lot of those people did okay, but there's so many people who have been entirely destroyed. They're just not wanting necessarily to have a spotlight. And so there's a lot of people that I've talked to who have reached out to me who had to leave the fields that they love,
Hmm.
don't have work. Like there's many more of those stories than there are success stories.
Yeah, and there's some of the stories she'll talk about, and I can relate in a similar situation where we're we're fortunate to be able to, be at a point in our lives where we can survive that and move on to do something else, and it's very freeing. But for many
Hmm.
people, when your livelihood depends on it, you don't have any choice, and it's but someone like her whose livelihood dependent upon it, I just want to read her quote to just give her just due. She said, "It's easier if you're just an individual, but I don't know how you could live with yourself if what you're doing is going against your conscience. Integrity is really, really important to me. It's something that was instilled in her by her family at an early age, according with some help from old classic novels by authors like Charles Dickens and Jane Austen. They're all about living with integrity." And she was a woman who did and never did anything wrong, but got excited, and and uh, and and um, and I guess I don't know the quote. Well, it's your quote. You say, "Building new, better communities as well as institutions is the antidote to toxic ones." That's true if
Yeah.
it were only so easy, however, and especially when the institutions are powerful, and it's not always easy. And in her case, she couldn't do it. In fact, that's the big challenge. It sounds nice to build communities, but it's often a challenge. And ooh,
Well, you can build little communities around you that might just be your friends, right? When it
yes,
comes to building a community for something that you do, that's professionally, that's certainly harder. With friendships, I think it's better to have fewer friends, but friends that, see the best in you and that don't, always have good faith and you feel like yourself with and have authentic relationships with than having, 100 or 1,000
well, in fact,
strangers.
as a very dynamic woman, a friend of my wife's from Australia, worked for the government there. He said, "Well, it's okay if they don't like me. I got enough friends. It's kind of crowded as it is, so it's okay."
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but it's hard for people
it
because I
is. It's
think,
hard.
and I know with COVID, like I think, because community, I think, is a very big underlying aspect to why we're even seeing a lot of these things happening. I think people are lonely. People don't have a sense of community, things that bond them. So they find these communities often based on, something more ideological. And they cling to them, and I think that's it's just been made far worse by the I think it started way before COVID, the pandemic, but I think it definitely amplified everything because everyone was so isolated. And then the toxicity of the social media world on top of that, I think that didn't help things. And especially because people now saw their lives as being online because they weren't meeting people in person. So I think that just made things so much worse. And we're still there because I think people
Mm.
now don't meet other people as much in person.
Well, it's certainly a lot
Even
easier to be mean online, as we know,
yeah.
than in person, and we'll maybe talk about that. But number two is Kat Rosenfeld, who says, and the moral there is, don't seek approval from bullies. Um, w- why don't well she was a young adult fiction author, and why don't you tell what happened to her? And I want to quote something from her because it resonated with me. Why don't you tell what happened to her?
Yeah. So Kat is, yeah, so she was in the young adult writing side of things. She was actually in a similar group to my group.
Hmm.
So she was part of that network. And there was an author who was coming up with a book that was about that people decided was racist. I don't even think they had read it, that book, because it wasn't out yet. And so they said, let's do this campaign to have this book, sent back for revisions. But because this is now controversial, we'll go to revisions and it will never come out of revisions. So essentially, they wanted to kill this author's book. And Kat made a post on social media, sort of referencing it without being overly specific, but they figured it out. And so they sort of went after her. And there was an account, like a sock puppet account on X, that was, I guess, spewing some racist things. And they accused her of being that account, which was completely ridiculously false, provably so too. But that didn't help.
Facts don't really matter when
Facts
accusations are
don't
made
matter.
online.
Exactly. So they did this whole campaign to try to get her canceled. But she's a very fierce person, I would have to say. And she is one of those people where like her community can be tiny. She doesn't care. But she
Yeah, well,
wrote a piece about it later on. Yeah.
yeah, we'll get to that. But the thing that she noticed at the very beginning, even before this happened, was she noticed that, there were people mobilizing, to call out certain writers who, you know, and say there were more deserving candidates,
Yeah.
and so push out people for more deserving candidates. She said it was very high school. There was a clique of four women. If you traced it back, anytime there's one of these big blowups, it'd always be one of them. It there is, and I've seen it happen in both personally and in other examples in my own field of physics, where you see the people speaking out the most, you can't help but feel there's some jealousy. People who feel that some people are achieving something that they would like to be in, and that either they or others that they know are more deserving. And the solution is to take down the people who somehow have achieved success. It's happened in as I say in physics. It was a campaign of that eventually got rid of a vice president of research at a university of a physicist I know named Steve Shu. It was a group named Particles for Justice that basically, ended up saying he was racist for supporting research that was published in the National Academy of Sciences. Or recently there was an article that came out. There's a black physicist, Hakeem Oluseyi, who spoke out in favor, saying that the James Webb wasn't a homophobe, and and a young woman that was discussed in this article, a young woman physicist, not only attacked him and made very suggestive arguments about inappropriate things he might have done they didn't do, but also apparently had a book coming out at the same time as his, and we're telling people not to review his books for this. You can't help but sort of feel this kind of that somehow it's a sense that either the people are there don't deserve it, and even if you don't deserve it, you don't want them to have success
Yeah.
because you don't. And you can't help but think that there maybe is part of the fact that your success isn't as great that drives some of these people to be so vociferous in their desire to ensure that to remove people, that they don't like, so that no one else can hear them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the thing is, it is that removal is permanent because what's the point of all of this ultimately? Like, is it to if you're trying to just protect society, right? Then
Hmm.
maybe you have a conversation, let the person know what they're doing, give them a chance to correct their behavior. There's a few other things you can do if the person is actually, at potential fault here. But but a lot of these things are designed to destroy the person entirely. And it doesn't matter what they've done, the punishment seems to be like the same. Because I do think there are certain cases where, of course, like a person has some accountability, has done certain things wrong, has to, take the L, as they say, as the kids say.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if your goal is to have a better society where maybe there's less racism or less sexism or whatever it is, then you would take steps to help that, and figure out what those are. And it isn't just to remove that person permanently. And as we've seen, you know the goal of somebody losing their job is to eliminate their voice forever. And as somebody on another podcast, Bridget Fetisi is the one who has actually said it, so I'll give her credit, is that it was essentially what's the goal of like having someone lose their job? Well, now they can't make a living, and they can't make a living how they're supposed to live, how they're supposed to feed themselves or their families. So it's literally the elimination of that human being from the face of the earth, because that's the natural consequence of that. And then it's the same, and there's people who've taken their lives over some of these accusations. And I don't know if some of the accusations had some merit to them or not, but they were completely judged in the court of public opinion. So, certainly the person didn't deserve, even if the worst accusations were true, that person didn't deserve to be, have their entire life taken away.
Absolutely. And the case, even whether undeserved or deserved, um, just because, in the case of removing an actor or someone else, just because you don't like them doesn't mean no one else can ever, you're deciding that no one else can ever watch or appreciate or enjoy anything they've ever done because you don't.
Yeah.
That kind of solipsism is extreme. And the, and, uh, I've quoted this before often, but Ricky Gervais, who was on one of the podcasts, used this example.
I love him.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like someone going to a city center and seeing a sign, you know, on a billboard saying guitar lessons, and you tear off the number, and then go home and phone them and say, I don't need any damn guitar lessons. I mean, it's like it's like you have to, okay, just if you don't like it, just leave it. You don't have
Well,
to
that's
watch it. You don't have to listen to it. But it doesn't
Well,
mean
that's the
no one
heckler's
should.
veto. That's the heckler's veto situation, right? Where you're seeing so many people where there'll be like a live event and people are like hate the speaker. I mean, there was one recent example Fire, I think, tweeted about was it was a concert by a musician. I think he was an Israeli musician. Or maybe just Jewish. I don't even know. People
Hmm.
can't tell the difference.
Hmm.
But the truth is, but it was a sold out concert,
Hmm.
right? So people wanted to see him, and yet there were these disruptors. And so they were taking away somebody else's ability to hear somebody else. And it's the same with lectures. So it's not to say that this is difficult because there are some cases where I'm like, okay, if my money is going into it, I'm a student, and let's say it's like a Holocaust denier
Yeah.
and it's being propped up by the university, how would I feel about that? Right. So I have to ask myself that question. But
Yeah,
at
I
this,
mean,
so
none of, you know, that's look, I think the point of all this is that
Mhm.
there are it's hard to generalize about a lot of things, and you have to look at things by case basis. And and if it's
That's how
something
I
that's
feel.
particularly if it's something that's particularly emotional to you, it's harder to have a rational perspective on it as well. But the
Well, you
thing.
need a universal basis at the same time, right? Because you can't, this is the problem, because a lot of people that I've seen being like free speech advocates, when it comes to something that is affecting them, suddenly they're like, yeah, let's cancel that speech. Or and so you do have to have a certain consistency. Like I won't, I have a particular outlook on certain things, where I don't support maybe certain speakers at all, but I won't, advocate for their removal. Now, I won't go see them, but I won't advocate for their removal because I want to remain consistent. At the same time, if it was a speaker who was denying a violent event or that is well
Mhm.
documented, or calling for violence in some way or promoting that violence, that's different to me because I have always drawn the line at
Well,
violence.
promoting
So you
violence is
can,
one thing.
yeah,
Denying reality is not the same as promoting violence. So denying that something
no.
happened, if it happened, is stupid, and but it's not should in you know in my mind is speech that should be protected, and it's just and
Well,
even
I
I
haven't
guess I would even be
protested
like
any of
Noam
it.
Chomsky to say that the Nazis in Skokie should be allowed to march, in the old days, because
Yeah, I just think that I think we have to be aware that it isn't like a perfect thing, just like
mm,
libertarian, like if
yeah,
you think like everything is going to work out, it's not.
yeah.
So there's going to be downsides to it. Like, yeah, because maybe people will come listen to it and some will be convinced because there's not an opposition, or that maybe somebody's a better speaker than somebody else. It doesn't mean that the argument is stronger, but it just
It's
means
true.
is
It's
the other isn't
rhetoric can win.
represented.
That's why I no longer try
Yeah.
to do debates. I used to debate a lot because it's never informational. It's always rhetorical. By the
Yeah.
way, I had to when you talked about your attitude. I don't know if you were influenced um, by Kat Rosenfeld, but her statement was remarkably the same as yours when she said, "I definitely had a moment where if someone calls you a racist, the first thing you think is like, oh God, am I?" And the thing was that, for after a few days of this and seeing how these people behaved, I was like, do I care if this person who is tweeting like the most vitriolic, horrible shit at a stranger over and over, do I care if this person thinks badly of me? No. Even this person's good opinion would not be a compliment. I don't want that person to think well of me. It reminded me,
So if,
and that's why, as you say, she said ultimately her defense of all this was creating a small circle of loyal friends whose opinions you care about and trust. These are important lessons because many people, many of us have experienced this. Many people will experience this. How do you respond to this? To either a mob hate word or even a small among group of friends, as to one of the solutions is to find a group of loyal friends who you can talk to and be honest in their criticism but never cruel. And I think
You
her
know what
case,
was interesting with that is when I heard her say that, because I had to arrive at that earlier,
yeah.
since I was in the middle of it.
Hmm.
But it was really reassuring, I think, to hear that her saying that. And a lot of the stories I found like little bits of myself in them, even
Oh,
though they're all quite different, but
oh,
there was a
sure.
lot of, yeah.
And I did too, but I think many other people who haven't had the experiences will still feel little bits themselves. I mean, I created the foundation I have by taking a small group of people who were willing, who were loyal friends, who were, and it's the way to. And now it's and I'll talk about it. One of the people talked about it somewhere else, but I mean, uh, it's hard to work within institutions. It's great if you can create something that you can control, and that has been for me moving away from the institutions of academia to take something that we have control over, that there is not some nameless group who tell you what you can do, is a very liberating experience if you're lucky enough, as I am and some other people are, to have that opportunity to be liberated and do what you want and still be able to survive. Now,
Yeah.
speaking of KKK and that, let's talk about number three, Daryl. You mentioned earlier Daryl Davis talking to everyone, even awful people. What a remarkable guy, an interesting fellow. As you say, black guy who um who grew up in a period where he experienced racism in the real sense, not an
Yeah.
imaginary sense, and then he um, he talked to someone, right? Isn't that the way it worked? Isn't that how it started?
It started, yeah. He talked to somebody approached him. He was performing, I think it was boogie woogie music.
Yes.
He's a great, jazz musician, and the guy admired his playing. I thought he'd never seen a black person play that kind of music before. And then as they got talking, it turns out the guy was a Klan member. But he started getting other Klan members to come see
Yeah.
them. And that's kind of where it started from there. Daryl is in many ways has been my role model ever since I heard of his story and before I'd even talked to him for this book, because that's why I do talk to people. I choose to talk to people sometimes who, are, say, Holocaust deniers or,
Mm-hmm.
pretty indoctrinated into the Nazi side of things and the real stuff, not the things that everybody
Yeah.
gets called every once in a while. And I do talk to people whose views I do find abhorrent, and in large part because of him. And also, I remember watching this guy on TV who was also a member of the KKK, or just not KKK, but neo-Nazi
Mm-hmm.
group. And by all means, you should write this guy off. He actually committed crimes. He went to prison. Bad dude, you'd think. But here he was at this point in his life, realized he was wrong and was actually helping get other people out of those groups. So it just showed me that somebody you would find just so completely abhorrent in their actions and their beliefs, and yet even they can sometimes change. And I emphasize sometimes, because some people, as Daryl says in the book, they'll go to their graves and they'll never change.
Yeah.
But some people do, and you have to understand why they believe what they believe. And if you don't understand, you can't address it either. And in his case, a lot of the recovery, I'll call it, was done because they got to know him. And he says, how can you hate somebody you don't know?
Yeah.
And in his case, and he talks in the book about, the different reasons that people might end up in these, I'll just call them mind cults, because that's
Mhm.
really what they are.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of reasons. Not all of it is necessarily just based in hate. Um, and he managed to get, I mean, there were like, I think 30 people that have given him their hoods because they got out, including Klan leaders.
Yeah, when you say he
So
was collecting hoods, I thought he was collecting honorary degrees, and then I realized what what he was
I
collecting.
sometimes slip and accidentally say hoodies.
Yeah.
Like, that's not it. That's not it either.
That's definitely
But I
not
think
it.
it's I think a really valuable lesson, at least to me. And so it guides me a lot in the work that I've been doing now.
Absolutely. Reading his stories that way. And, it's more generous than I usually am. But one should remember that people rarely do bad things because they want to do. They usually think there's a reason why they're doing them. And if
Yeah.
they're hateful, I mean, if they're doing awful things, there's usually a reason they think they're doing the right thing. They're just wrong. I mean, there are people obviously psychotic and et cetera. And so there's the hope that people, if they can be, if they can see that they weren't doing the right thing, will change. But it requires talking. And I think there's a statement he made here. There's two things that I want to say about him before we leave. One, he says, Davis believes that elected officials like senators and congressmen do have an obligation to sit down and talk with people with whom they disagree. Why? Because they do not represent one particular group. They represent everybody in their district, and they can disagree with one another. It's the saddest thing about the U.S. and one of the reasons I left is the fact that it's dysfunctional because politicians, which is politics is supposed to be the art of compromise. It's not that at all,
No.
and it's groups that refuse to listen to one another, and if you don't do that, then I don't know what the future of democracy is, and he's
Although
and
Canada
Davis.
is obviously on the same path, sadly.
Yeah, exactly. But Davis says, what's the solution? Tell people to grow a pair of balls, explains Davis. Get them to realize they've got a voice, speak out. But one of the things that I think is the last thing I want to mention about him, which is just points out, it says it all, as again Ricky Gervais might say, in the process of talking to these people and being willing to reach out to people whose views are abhorrent and in principle who hate in the abstract would hate him. He was even once called a white supremacist by an anti-racist group. And I think there you
Yeah.
go. It says a lot about anti-racism that they would call this black guy a white supremacist. And I think
I mean,
that's,
I was being called a white supremacist, and white supremacists hate me. So,
yeah,
you know,
yeah, of course. But you're not black. It makes it
I'm not
easier.
black.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
makes, I know it's easier to make the
You,
point with
you,
someone
you,
who's,
you used to be white, although now when with someone, Jews are now, they're now white. They didn't used to be white, but now they're white.
I don't identify as white, just
Yeah,
saying.
yeah. I try not to identify as
But
any.
it doesn't accept, they don't, but I don't get accepted. Like, it's like
Yeah,
whatever
yeah, yeah.
label, like the neo-Nazis want to stick one label and
Well,
the
that's the
supremacist label.
problem we'll get to it, but one of the big problems of anti-racism is it's just racism warmed over, as Thomas Sowell has said, the famous black economist,
Yeah.
who uh, who has also said the big problem of what you pointed out is that people protecting other people from things they don't want to even to be protected from is part in a book which he just wrote of social justice fallacies, the idea that people think they know better than people who are experiencing it what they should be experiencing because they know
All
it's a
of
very
this
deep
comes
intellectual
from,
attitude of us academics, and I've been an academic most of my
yeah,
life, so I know the attitude.
yeah,
Anyway,
very
let's talk
pretentious.
about the next person, Steve Elliott, who did suffer um, tremendously, and his is stick to your principles. He was Me Too'd, and during the early stage, or one of the, I mean, during the height of Me Too, when Me Too craziness, which I know about.
Hmm.
And why don't you tell about what happened to him?
Yeah, I don't know why, but his one of the ones that resonates with me the most, even though I have no personal
Yeah.
experience of being Me Too'd, for all I know, but essentially, it's interesting because I encountered Stephen in a setting where I heard him speak before I read about him, which gave me an ability to sort of see his story from a different angle. And what really resonated with me, so what happened with Stephen was that he was named in a list called Shitty Media Men.
Shitty media
Uh,
man. Yeah.
it was an anonymous list of accusations, and he was accused, of the worst thing, right? Rape. And
He's a Hollywood screenwriter, right? Just so,
yeah, so he's
yeah.
a Hollywood screenwriter. He's also an author of of books and used to
Just so we put in
edit. Very,
perspective.
yeah,
And
yeah,
he's labeled
appreciate
in
that.
shitty
And
media men for rape, which is
yeah,
almost provably false in his case, as you can point out.
yeah, in his case, it's pretty much provably false because of, he's been very open about his own
That
sexuality. He
his
doesn't have
sexuality was
intercourse.
doesn't involve
Yeah,
having intercourse with women, among other
yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So in his case, so a lot of the people around him actually knew that he wasn't guilty, but they still sort of condemned him. And in particular, he talks about how things became even worse following that anonymous accusation, because he ended up suing the person who put out that list of anonymous accusations. And he's somebody who was very interested in the justice system in general. Um,
In fact, let's stop there. He was not only interested in that. This is intriguing to me because this often happens. If you think of Al Franken, people who were Me Too were people who were the most sympathetic to feminist causes. He had considered himself a far left feminist, thought he was doing everything to be good. The Rumpus, which he served as an editor-in-chief of, was extremely liberal and intentionally diverse. He claims credit for discovering literary figures like Cheryl Strayed and Roxane Gay and giving them a platform. Under his leadership, the publication had monthly events to make sure and always included women and people of people of color. Forgive me. We were trying to be good and see this, and these were the things we thought we were supposed to do. And it is interesting to me that I've seen those people often singled out. People like him, a physicist, Jeff Marcy, who got singled out in Me Too, was someone who's an extreme feminist who'd worked hard to have students who fostered them and developed them, and they seem to be the most susceptible. It surprises
Well, on
me.
the one hand, it's easier because, they are in that world, so it's easier to target them. On
Yeah,
the other hand, I also think some of them are guilty. I mean,
yeah.
even in my case, like I know some of the people who were, it was a very tricky time for me because during Me Too, there were a lot of people that were named that I personally knew.
Hmm.
And with some people, I don't know if that was true or not.
Hmm.
And other people, some people were convicted, so
Yeah.
it wasn't and I knew I had some experiences with them, luckily not anything like, worthy of. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who are also posing as feminists who,
Yeah,
are
yeah.
actually, so it's a mixed bag. But I think in this case where I found this story to be important was that it is about it, accusations, anonymous accusations, and no due process whatsoever. Not even really a fair due process in the court of public opinion in that way, right? You have somebody having no risk, making an accusation that's the worst, the most vile accusation, and the
Anonymous
person takes the
accusations
brunt.
with no repercussions if you're lying or wrong. Nothing,
Yeah.
zero. But every repercussion, as we'll see in the case of his case and others, every repercussion for the person who's accused, who has basically no way of responding to an anonymous accusation other than saying it's false.
Exactly. And that's where, to me, that's where the story was. Because no doubt there are people on that list who probably, have done bad things. And I remember when that list came out, I was like, oh, well, as a woman, I kind of want to be warned. But at the same time, ultimately after I'd thought it through, I thought, yeah, no, anonymous accusations should never be done this way. It's one thing is your friend comes to you and says,
Yeah,
listen, this guy is kind
yeah,
of a creep.
yeah,
Okay, yeah, you want to know that.
yeah.
Um, because you can't always go to, through due process for all
No.
sorts of reasons in court. Maybe they haven't done anything that's worthy of that. But maybe they're still creepy,
Well, think about it,
somebody
creepy isn't a
touching you
crime.
inappropriately. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, for example, I've been touched inappropriately. Like, am I going to go out and destroy this person's life? No, it's
As
still inappropriate. I wish at the time I could have been more vocal about it and said, listen, what the hell are you doing?
That's the problem. I think most people wish they'd done something differently, and that anger and resentment builds up. But it's happened to everyone.
Yeah.
All of us have been touched inappropriately or spoken to inappropriately. It's part of life, for better or worse. If the world were wonderful, it wouldn't happen. And part of being an
Yeah.
adult is learning how to deal with it. And sometimes you don't deal with it the way you wanted to. But if you don't, you then can't say, well, society's got to deal with it because I didn't deal with it the way I want, and I'm angry now 10 years later or whatever
No,
else.
and there's proportionality too. Like, I have a friend whose name I won't mention, but he got very badly canceled during the Me
Mm.
Too era. And I didn't know him very well when I, found his story or when we connected. So, and I thought to myself, okay, like in his case, I don't even know if that this was an accurate representation of what had happened. But I thought, okay, what if everything that he's
It's
being
true.
accused of didn't is true? what does he deserve as a consequence? And there was clearly like a massive
Yeah.
disproportionality there. And so that's where I think, again, I come back to this. A lot of the times the punishment is kind of the same no matter what somebody does. Like if somebody misspeaks, like they shouldn't have their world canceled versus somebody who actually does an action that truly harms somebody.
And that's what problem. I mean, there's a quote here. There's all the cases were lumped together in the public's imagination, from rape to saying the wrong thing at a party. Um, it was easy to convict in the court of public opinion, and this is Eliot's point. And it sounds trite, but it's so not observed today. That you've got to assume innocence. You have to assume innocence. That's the point, insists Eliot. There's no other way. I mean, it's imperfect, and you're going to end up with somebody assuming somebody's innocent that isn't. But unless you have more information and there's an anonymous and the, but unless you have more information and there's an anonymous circulating accusation, you have to assume innocence. And you have to act as if they're innocent. You can't deny them the opportunity. You can't say, I'm not going to be around that person because it might look bad for me. This notion that uh, uh, it is imperfect, and I don't know if you quoted here or someone. Well, yeah, Benjamin Franklin. It's better to have 100 guilty persons should escape than one innocent person should suffer.
Yeah.
But in this case, this notion it's never brought up. An accusation is made, and in his case, even though it was there were clear reasons, provable reasons, as there have been for many people, why it's impossible. The accusation is all that's necessary, and innocence is never assumed, because it's assumed as a property of and I think you talk about it, a property of Me Too. Believe all women, that sort of thing. That always has to be.
Yeah. And once it got to that point, I think that's where it got really problematic. Because, of course, talking about, I think it was an important thing to be able to talk about what was going on. And it was happening, by the way, to men too, maybe to a lesser degree, but it was. And I have
Yeah.
men that shared their stories with me. I think being able to talk about it and figuring out ways to deal with it, I think were important. But once it becomes, let's just accuse, every day somebody was being accused. And then the accusations got more bizarre too. So to me, that was the problem with it. And I guess that's what happens with movements. And I know Elliot, Stephen talks about that in greater detail too.
Yeah,
But
I
it's
said it. What
something
started
that,
as a movement. Can I interrupt you? Because I'm going to read
Mhm.
I'm going to read from you, so I'm not really interrupting
Sure.
you. I'm giving you a
No, it's
voice.
okay.
You
I
say,
don't get
but,
offended. So
that's good. But because I tend to interrupt. But anyway, what started as a movement based on creating awareness eventually turned into a mob focused on punishment, if not revenge, against often indiscriminate targets. There's a moment in every movement where it becomes irrational. The moment it becomes irrational and people are finding reasons to support it, it's a mob. That's a letter quote, and I think it's from Stephen. And I think
Mhm.
that's the key point. When a movement becomes a mob, then you've got to be worried about it. And what's important is here's a guy who's speaking out, sticking to his principles. But what you have to realize is that life changed. You say he didn't really talk to anyone. He stopped going outside. He didn't even watch TV. He just read books for 15 months. He went into hibernation. I have a very famous friend of mine who was hit, and he said he never read anything but the sports pages for 6 months because he knew, because he'd be in the newspaper all the time, and it's incredibly difficult for you and your family. And that's the other thing people don't realize. It's not just the individuals, it's everyone around them, their family and it's often hardest on the family because they can't speak out. But he says even today, he doesn't think he'll ever be able to make a living as a writer again. Losing his agent, his publisher, and his opportunities was hard. And this is a guy who won the suit, by the way, the won the lawsuit.
Yeah.
Let's make it clear. But more than that, he
And it
says,
was
I
just
lost my
settled and
tribe. I lost so many close friends, so many people that I thought were really important in my life. That was harder than anything else for Elliot. Anybody that tells you otherwise is not being honest, and I know this, or they have not been canceled in the worst possible way. Getting kicked out of your tribe is particularly difficult because you lose your entire identity. As Elliot learned, you no longer know who you really are, and it's hard for many people to recreate themselves in a different way. Some people have, and we'll talk about them here. And I know from
Yeah.
that experience, but that,
And that's the thing too with we're thinking about somebody like Kevin Spacey who actually has gone through the legal system,
yeah,
and in the eyes of the world he's still guilty, and I find that kind of interesting because I did look at the court case,
yeah,
and even in my own mind, like I'm struggling with it, right? And once that accusation is made, or accusations in particular,
yeah.
it's very hard to, doesn't matter if you're found innocent, to be honest,
Yeah. Oh,
because
in
in the
fact, it's
public
often
court,
never even covered. I
it's
mean,
not. And that, yeah,
the statement about Kevin Spacey, being found innocent in these court cases received far less
of
print,
course.
and in fact, he says it. While he won the case, it will never rewind the destruction of the media outlets that covered the initial accusations against him. Far fewer covered the settlement, and I've seen that happen. It's much more because it's clickbait. You get a much more
Yeah.
attention for making a salacious, you know, a, 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 a devious accusation than to make the statement that it's wrong. It's and by the way, the same is true in I've noticed this as a scientist. This is not just these kind of um, uh, emotional and cultural and things. And in science, I've often seen you'd see journalists quote some scientists, "Oh, this new discovery is this," and all of us realize it's garbage. And then
Hmm.
3 weeks later, when it's proved to be wrong, there's never a newspaper story about it. It's part of the problem
Makes
because it's
sense.
not as
Yeah.
exciting. It doesn't sell papers.
Or anytime there's a mistake making, made, it's something that does not get covered once there is a correction. It's like hidden somewhere in small font on the page that
Yeah.
nobody's reading anymore because they moved on.
Yeah. Now, you can say here, he says, as Elliot concludes, we've reached some kind of critical mass where everybody knows somebody's been falsely accused. I keep hoping it's going to be a critical mass, but it doesn't seem to be. You say we can only hope this means the tide is finally shifting and that we as a public will no longer reflexively condemn and punish based on anonymous accusations. I'm afraid you're too young and optimistic. I think I think
I
we'll
am
talk about this.
optimistic. Yeah.
People have said the tide is shifting, and I keep seeing things where big events we may talk about, and a friend of mine once said, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and so far I've yet to see the opposite. But
What I'm seeing is the pendulum swinging back potentially in a not in a nice way.
yeah, not in a nice way. Okay, let's go. The next person, Peter Bogosian, who happened to know specifically because Peter's been a friend, and I've actually appeared in his classes and spoken out for him. And I will say, um, I'm proud of the fact. I think Peter, anyway, that I helped him write his letter of resignation. So, um, which I mean, helped edit it and suggest things. He wrote it,
Mm.
but his case is an interesting one because he he was at well, in Portland, where I happened to live at the time, but he started out being well known because of getting in trouble because of the grievance affair. So why don't you talk about that?
Okay, so the grievance affair is actually have first. I actually heard. I didn't know his name, but I did hear of the grievance affairs,
Hmm.
which was, essentially planting ridiculous articles, I guess, in
Ridiculous
these,
articles in gender studies journals,
yeah, in
about
gender studies
rape in
journals.
dog parks and things like that.
Yeah, the one that stands out the most is the rape in dog parks. Yeah, and there's a few more that were accepted, and I
Yeah,
think that made a lot of.
yeah, you're young, as you are, and I don't know if you probably weren't even born when the so-called affair happened, but
I do know
but
of this,
yeah, but
but
you
yeah.
know of it because you mentioned the book. But it was a takeoff on that. That Alan Sokol wrote it, was making fun of postmodernism in 1996, I think, and wrote a piece based on physics that was just nonsense and published it in a distinguished social journal, and then announced it was a hoax later on. And they did this for, I think, 20 papers they submitted to journals, and 7 of them, I think, got accepted by these journals. So go on. But that
Yeah,
automatically
so
put them on the radar.
yeah, exactly. So that put him on the radar, and I think
In
a lot
fact,
of
I
people.
think, by the way, it would put him on the radar in the sense that he was actually called to task because of misconduct or research misconduct. because they wrote these spoof papers, and so therefore it was research misconduct, and he was immediately called to task by the university for that.
Yeah. Definitely shame on him. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
but that he was also somebody who was quite he would bring in a lot of different kinds of speakers
yeah.
who were maybe not so well accepted by the orthodoxy. And as a result, he was definitely getting a lot of backlash. Maybe wasn't so loved by certain uh, individuals on campus.
On campus, and he was already knowing that he was already being learning about diversity, the famous diversity panels, university, and he discovered when he went to one of them, as you say, there was no diversity in the diversity panel. It was made up of
That's
different
right.
faculty members, but they all had the same opinions and they were identical. And that's when he started to and he was reported. I'm just summarizing from you, and then we can talk. Two times
Yeah, go ahead.
reported. One, he was asked by a student if race was a social construct or a valid biological category. He responded that as an educator and a philosopher, not a biologist, and that question should be asked to a biologist. He was reported for that. And then he asked I remember when him telling me this, he asked the university's chief diversity officer to explain diversity to him, and he offered to take him out to lunch, and he was reported for asking that question. Reported
That's right.
for asking the question gives you a sense of where he's at.
I
And
imagine they were seeing it as sort of a, adversarial positioning, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you have to do like investigations into him for that or
and
report him.
and he was being investigated up the wazoo. I mean, he talked to me, and it wasn't easy. I mean, Peter is as you say, he talks about fuck you. Okay, just don't send up these guys. But I know personally from talking to him during the time when he phoned me up that it's still, no matter how tough you are, it takes its toll on you personally, and you and your family, and worried about that. And but nevertheless, he points out that why shouldn't some people be offended? And why shouldn't you say fuck you? So maybe we want to talk about that.
No, by the way, I think part of his fuck you reaction is because ultimately it is an emotional thing. So I think sometimes people build these walls to sort of deal with that. Because if you're constantly receiving an onslaught of hate, in his case, he apparently was spit on. People dropped bags of feces on at his office. They I think drew a swastika with his name underneath it. So, I mean, the proportionality of somebody's disagreement with him, whether it's questioning DEI policies or doing the hoax papers, it was just extreme. And this is, it ties back in with that statistics that we were talking about earlier, where people feel justified that they can just use violence for speech that they don't like or speech that they think is bad, harmful speech. This is also why, I tried to at some point talk to Antifa members and reason with them,
Yeah.
which is kind of insanity on my end, probably. But I didn't know that much about them, but I was trying to talk them out of using violence
Uh-huh.
because, but to them, the way that they see a person that they just, because they think they're horrible, they see
Mm.
them as Nazis, and therefore they're not human beings anymore. That's
That's
why it justifies the violence because they're not using that violence against actual humans.
Well, that's a long history of that, right? From Jews and everyone else.
Right,
And
right. And they don't
Hutu,
see that.
the whole way to create violence is to not see someone as human, and that's an old, it goes back. But he also makes a point after using the "fu" about 3 or 4 times again. That's all you need to say. He says, but here's the reason. People think that if they say they're sorry, they'll be redeemed. They'll be forgiven if they just apologize. But there is no forgiveness. There's no forgiving of people in the new religion. The new religion doesn't forgive people, and this is the new religion. In his case, he would say of social justice, I suppose. That and I've said it too. That that I'm a well-known atheist, but the one thing Christianity has is redemption. The new secular
Redemption.
religion doesn't even have that.
Well, and we need redemption very much as a society if we want to actually have a functioning society. And the fact that there is no, you're this or that immediately, and there's no conversation, there's no opportunity, not just for redemption, but for like trying to understand where that person is coming from. Or even if you're really so inclined to change their mind, I don't think that's what conversations should be based on.
Hmm.
But at the same time, like, even if that's what you wanted to do, to try to do that first before, making that person no longer exist, which seems to be the ultimate goal, at least not exist in a way that's functional in society in any way over anything that you disagree. It's
Yeah,
an
and his
emotional reaction too, right?
and for people who don't know, what he did ultimately was choose to resign. Choose to resign not because of accusations that were outstanding, because of various accusations.
He was
Uh,
cleared.
it was clear, and those accusations had no due process. I know from experience and also from talking to him, no due process. But even in
Yeah.
those no due process investigations, he was cleared without an apology. But that wasn't the reason he quit. He basically said, um, for 10, the last sentences of his letter of resignation, for 10 years, I taught my students the importance of living by your principles. One of mine is to defend our system of liberal education from those who seek to destroy it. Who would I be if I didn't? And he basically said, this is a system I can't be a part of. I can't change it from within, not at my university. I can't be a part of it, and I'm going to resign. And I think, that was a strong, and it got a lot of attention because of that, I think, because it was a statement about
The state of
the system
academia.
having a problem and not him. What was that?
About the state of academia, yeah,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is
Yeah, the
a
state of
lot of
academia
people
is
are.
abysmal. Okay, let's move on to a student, I think. Christopher
Are we doing
Wells.
all 16 chapters?
What was that?
I said, are we doing all 16 chapters?
We may. We'll see how long we go. We'll see till we
Okay.
get both tired. I wanted to, but we may skip some. We'll probably go faster through some of them. But
Okay.
just so you know, we're on number 6. So, but remember, we spent about 45 minutes talking about other stuff. So which is
Yeah.
important. So Christopher Wells, a student, said, "Don't be open-minded, but don't be gaslit." What? Let's just briefly mention what he did, because it's an interesting case, really, it's really the story of what university should be for everyone is what happened to him. In a sense, I saw it an uplifting story rather than a depressing story like some of the others. So why don't you,
I thought it was, his journey was interesting. So he was a very outspoken student, but,
Mhm.
he started out he was part of the Young Democrats. I
Mhm.
think he was one of the
Mhm.
leaders. He had a club in high school, and then he kind of got to know this friend of his who's like a Ben Shapiro character, and they would
Yeah.
argue all the time. And that introduced him to, I think, a different way of thinking, though he, still remained more left leaning. But when he entered university, he found that the environment was just very non-tolerant towards any kind of dissenting points of views. And well, you probably know the story better than I do at this point.
Well, because I read your book more recently than you've written it. Yeah. But well, what was important is he did what should happen at universities. The environment was intolerant, but he nevertheless met people with whom he disagreed. He met conservatives, had lunch with them, and suddenly discovered they weren't evil people, which was a revelation for him.
For
And
me
I know
too.
that
Yeah.
feeling. I mean, it's really, and so he said, well, he was thus beginning to question his overall politics, which is what all of us should do. And it's a story of basically a a young man who learns to be open-minded and to understand, at least what's his name, David, and was it David or Daryl, like Daryl,
Yeah.
learns to be able to talk to people with whom he disagrees, and that maybe their ideas might actually change his own mind, and in some cases does. uh, and and he what he did do was openly question. I don't think he suffered. I don't know if I can't remember from this if he
No,
actually.
there was a point in which he had, and I think his girlfriend, yeah, he did, because of the whole black square fiasco.
Uh-huh.
I think he had sort of questioned that, but at a certain point, I mean, he's okay now, but um, he had a bit of a transformation because he was a little bit radicalized at a certain point, and then he
Yeah.
realized that's not a good way to go about things. And he now looks for just more kind of civil discourse with people, and he doesn't feel like he always has to state his opinion about everything. So he did go through, I think, quite a journey with that.
But what I found interesting about a story is we talk about Peter's view from the professor, and we'll talk about other professors who've had experiences. But this is the view of the student, and here's the thing that should also be chilling. I quoted some of the statistics at the beginning of your book because they were chilling, but he points out that older professors tend to go along because they have no choice. They go along with this. They're not true believers, although he's yet to meet a conservative professor. He said they tend to have more of a Noam Chomsky land than Noam's a friend, but that's okay. The new
Mhm.
the new crop of but this is the thing that's chilling. The new crop of PhDs, on the other hand, are true believers. Those are terrifying ones. They've been ideologically vetted because let's face it, right now, these days, many colleges and universities require applicants to fill out DEI statements in order to be considered for a position. So you're choosing the true believer. A lot, of course, some of the students, some kids I know
Fake
and
it.
postdocs, they write it just to, they do
Yeah.
that just to get through. But unfortunately, you get more and more of the true believers who are then going to become the senior faculty. And so this is the worrisome thing, is that the system of imposing loyalty oaths slowly getting faculty who are true believers in this nonsense, and then you get students who are true believers. And I think a quote from him at the end is, I mean, I was really amazed at his maturity for such a young person. But he said,
He's
I think
really
what I really
wise.
noticed is a generation of people being told exactly what to do, said Wells. And then when they enter the workplace and you have to kind of figure out, they're lost. So it's not just political at that point. It's a weak generation. It's an utterly helpless generation who've been coddled in every sense, yet are so self-righteous. I've heard and this is students. I was at Harvard there, so there's many Harvard students. I've heard someone say that when they go out and get jobs, they don't last because they suddenly discover that because employers discover they're coddled people who expect to be entitled for everything, and in the business world that just doesn't work. And so you've got a generation of people who are actually going to suffer because of being inappropriately educated.
And
And
they're
the
coddled by everyone. Like, I mean,
y-
you're coddled in school, but I also, because I'm an Eastern European, my parents did not coddle. I
yeah,
wish they coddled more.
yeah,
But I see how parents are about their kids, and it's like, man, you let the kid run the ship, the
yeah,
show.
yeah, yeah.
It's like not a healthy thing, I
Well,
think.
Jonathan Haidt and Greg Louganis were, I think, the coddling of the American mind.
Yeah.
But Wells looks at the struggle of past generations. This is, I found, where he's particularly astute. He looks at the struggle of past generations who've had to deal with wars, food shortages, and other profound hardships. He can't help but notice that, for whatever reason, my generation thinks we're in the worst of times. Like the people who are really entitled, especially university students being entitled, not because of race or anything.
Yeah.
Universities entitled, they think they're somehow unsafe and somehow in the worst of environments when they're in the safest of all environments.
If they're going to complain about anything, they should complain about the cost of real estate.
Yeah, 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 or the cost of tuition, which is certainly ridiculous. Well, the
Also
next two
that.
chapters are on two episodes in Brett Weinstein's life. The first one, I have to say, I'm more sympathetic to the first than the second, and I want to talk about it.
Hmm.
The first one is famous. Why don't you tell the story? I'll let you.
Okay, well, it's the famous Evergreen story. So they
Mm.
had a day at Evergreen where they basically wanted to only have Black students on campus that day, and no one else but Black students. In the past, they've had days to sort of showcase the importance of Black people by not having them on campus that day, but then they've changed it and made it like excluded everyone else. And so he wrote an email, stood up against that, didn't agree
He
with
basically said,
that.
"Is it okay for people to choose not to be there? That's their right. In fact, it's an important form of protest. But forcing
Hmm.
others to not be there is oppression. It's not protest." That was the statement.
Exactly. Exactly. And things kind of escalated from there. And in his case, his own students actually stood by him, and including students of color. But in terms of, he was pretty much driven out of the university, and
He
there was a
was driven.
lawsuit
They
as
they
well.
they actually, yeah, he was driven. They basically um uh it called for his firing, made it unsafe to be on campus. It wasn't supported by the university, and eventually and wasn't protected, and filed a lawsuit, which he eventually won, and
Hmm.
then left because obviously the environment was so toxic. Um,
Him and his wife. Well, I think the condition of the lawsuit also was that they leave. So
yeah,
it
yeah.
was, yeah.
I mean, and exactly. And when the suit settled, they had to leave and submit the resignation in return for some money, and then he was able to have another life. But it was it was the fact that based on that statement, it was untenable for him to remain at the university in every way that he could see, with no support from the university. And universities, I've often said this, not the first time. The real problem with universities are the academic administrators who have no spine and no guts. They will go with the wind. The minute they see that there's a protest, that it won't look good on social media, they'll flip whatever, they'll defend free speech in a moment until it looks bad on media. And you saw that in the testimony in the former Harvard president, who talked about free speech for anti-Semitism, but not so much for people who might
Oh yeah, it's
mispronounce
ridiculous.
someone's name.
It's
And uh, but and here's the point: the statement of this chapter is, know that your friends will disappoint you. And this was the point. We said earlier that and a lot of old faculty go along with it. Faculty are terrified. So many faculty will write letters. When I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal on the ideological corruption of science, I got letters from faculty thanking me, but they wrote under pseudonyms because they were so concerned that their own administrators or colleagues would learn about that. Does that sound like Russia? I mean, in the old days, and that's the
yeah.
problem. It takes a lot. You get a lot of private sympathy, as you did and he did, but very few people will be willing to speak out. And look, there's a very good reason, because they speak out, the same thing is likely to happen to them, and they may not be in a position to support their families or anything else. So it's not, you can condemn people that don't speak out, but you can also understand it.
I can understand it. That's why, I think some people come up at people pretty aggressively for not doing so, but I do think it's such a personal choice, and I don't know the personal circumstances of each person. They can be sick, they can have mental health issues, they can have families that depend on them and no other recourse. And so while, yes, that contributes to this environment, I want people to be able to still make that choice freely, and on their own terms ideally, and
Hmm.
not be like just forced to do so. But I know you said the second part of his story you're a little less sympathetic about, um which is interesting because I so the second part of the story revolves around more uh the COVID, the pandemic, and ivermectin in particular,
Yeah.
because he took a very vocal stance for ivermectin. And also he talked about the lab leak, when it was, considered for some
Which I am
reason
sympathetic to. I think the
racist.
evidence is
Yeah, the
strong.
lab leak, yeah, I think has a strong evidence. And
Yeah.
at this point, the tide has shifted a little bit on that particular point. Ivermectin, maybe not so much. And I encountered Brett when he was talking about ivermectin, and I sort of defended his right to speak about it, not because I believed that he was correct. I actually don't know if he is. And in
Hmm.
fact, I would probably even right now, I'm probably more in the direction of he's not.
Hmm.
However, I do defend his right to speak as somebody who is, has some science background, and frankly, like, his ideas should be debunked by people who have the facts.
Yeah, exactly. He shouldn't be deplatformed. I'm 100%.
Mhm.
I agree with you. It's not that I'm sympathetic to the ridiculousness of somehow having YouTube or other organizations somehow deplatform. Um, by the way, he also questioned the efficacy of vaccines. Okay, and and
Mm,
and
he has done that.
and it's probably worth. I don't know, maybe because you're worried about time. I'm not so much, but we'll go on for another half hour or so. But
Okay.
you know, the next person is Aaron Kheriaty, who was literally fired as a professor, a doctor, who was a medical ethicist, who was fired for publicly refusing to take the COVID vaccine. And his arguments were good ones. I mean, his arguments for personal freedom. He had felt he'd been exposed, he had natural immunity, and he was against a vaccine mandate. And and the problem, so let's put them together in a sense, because it's an issue that's an interesting one that is not so cut and dried. The problem that both Brett and Aaron point out is that there's a lot of power. The government is basically forcing people forcing the assumption that there's scientific consensus, and also enforcing mandates and silencing people who disagree, all of which sounds awful. Now,
Mm-hmm.
um, the the thing that's common about all this, and one of the reasons I was kind of hopeful about COVID at some level, was that it demonstrated that at the forefront, science is not certain. When you don't know, when you're in the unknown, almost anything goes. And science is a dialectic, as Jonathan Rauch has really written a beautiful book about. It requires debate. It requires people
Yes.
like Brett Weinstein to say, no, I don't agree with this, even if he's wrong. It requires that, because only then will you find out what's right. And you also may not even know what's right.
You may
You
not
know,
know for years,
yeah, for
right?
years,
Like,
because when it comes to vaccines, and you have to test people for many years, so you won't know the answer. And so it's important to have that debate. But from the same point of view, my my wife used to work for the government of Australia, bringing some putting scientists together with the government. And her point was that neither group knew what the other wanted or needed. Scientists seem to think that every public decision should be based on what they said was right. And politicians tended to say that, we'll use the science when it agrees with what we want to do anyway.
mm,
But the point is that I guess I'm less sympathetic, is that government has to make decisions even when they don't know all the answers. What I condemn them for is saying that there's scientific consensus. The Mr. Fauci is someone who I think did not behave well, but I never expected. He'd been an administrator of a laboratory for 40 years, which meant
mm-hmm.
he knew how to play up to government officials. You wouldn't survive as an administrator for 40 years unless you'd known how to play within the system. And he learned,
My
and he knew how to play
problem
within.
with the whole pandemic narrative, like, because I was pretty outspoken
Yeah.
about all of that. It wasn't the vaccines, which frankly, I don't even think I'm like authorized to really talk about because I
Okay.
don't have that expertise. So I don't really talk about it. I know what decision I've made for myself. And it's something that, statistically, I can look at statistics, I can
Yeah.
analyze those, and there were less people in the hospitals that were vaccinated. So I'm going to go based on that. Doesn't mean that there weren't like vaccine injuries, because there were. It's very difficult to know the exact numbers. And frankly, I haven't invested my whole time into really like analyzing that to be like speak with any authority. So I don't. I did speak with some authority, I think, on the mandates
Yeah.
because, and some confidence, because I was very opposed to the mandates. That was the issue. But that, I don't think you need to know the science for like,
Well, but
I
but
looked.
here I agree with
Mhm.
you. But and it's not a scientific issue. That's the point. Where I think it's kind of trite, and I understand completely where Brett and Aaron, are astutely point out all of the issues. And so it's their job to point out those issues and those uncertainties. It's their job to do that. But they should not expect government to act on their statements necessarily, because government has a lot of other things to consider. So, where the problem was saying that the science was settled. But what government, but the government couldn't do what government should have done, which is to say the science isn't settled. But we view the risk of the pandemic to be greater than the risk of vaccines, and we view it as a public safety issue. And we're imposing mandates not because of science, but because we think, just like we impose seatbelts, we impose many things that
Mhm.
infringe on people's rights, because we're making this assumption that if you don't have that if more people take the vaccine, fewer people will die, and by not taking the vaccine, you may be endangering other people. It may not be right. It's a it's a
Yeah.
it's a it's a it's a
But part of
decision someone
why
has to
they
make. What?
But part of what they did overall, if you follow the through line, is like wanted to control people's behaviors,
Oh,
right?
of
So they
course.
said things. So either they censored things that were true information, like
Yeah.
in the case of Facebook, about the vaccines, or they, they very much controlled the narrative. They controlled people behavior. I'm sure they knew that certain things like are provably not effective,
Mm-hmm.
and they made policies, and people often didn't challenge them. I can't say that I challenged it from the beginning myself because I had a level of trust for the government. And then when I started thinking logically about some of these things, I'm like, okay, this does not compute. This does not make any sense. And so they treated the population, they didn't trust the population to do the right thing. Like, let's say the masks, and let's say we say they
Mm.
work, right? Let's
Yeah.
not get on to that
Yeah.
argument, but like,
We don't
let's
know.
assume they work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And and yet the government at one point said, well, we masks don't work, right?
Yeah.
Because they wanted to control the supply instead of saying, well, actually they do, but we really need them for healthcare
Yeah.
for frontline workers. Now, some people will behave in selfish ways and not share them and still, hold the supply for themselves. But a lot of people, if you assume the best in people, often they will actually deliver. And maybe I'm optimistic, but I have seen that in real life in certain
Sure.
situations. So, in any rate, the government thinks that the population won't do the right thing and therefore they need to be manipulated. And now they have a situation where they've lied to the population repeatedly, and it destroyed the public health trust is destroyed, which is awful because if something else happens, we're going to see far worse situation that we saw during the pandemic.
I can't agree with you. The government shouldn't lie. They should be honest with what they're doing. And when, of course, when they are, they'll be thrown out of office. But that's a different story. When they say we're doing this for the real reasons that unfortunately politicians feel they have to lie and they do it for everything. But I didn't want to, but I brought this up not to put you in a trap, but to remind you of what you said, or
No
not really,
traps.
but remember you said, well, when we talked about allowing people to say things, you say, but what if they do it really well? And now I'm really worried that people get, someone's a good speaker, that people will believe this stuff. And so you've got to, I'm going to try and be generous and say the government has people like Joe Rogan spouting crap.
Mhm.
And by the way, I was on Joe Rogan and he was really amazing when I was on with him, but nevertheless, and these people are charismatic. You've got that other idiot whose name, not Joe's an idiot, that guy who got fined for saying that the kids, the families, got sued by the families of the kids who got shot.
I
Whatever his
know who
name
you're
is.
talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
whatever. He'll remain unnamed. It's probably just as well. But
Yes.
but you've got to worry. You've got the government saying there are charismatic people who have a platform who are telling people vaccines are dangerous. Don't take them. And so I've got to say, I've got to at least ask, what would I do if I was in that situation? I don't know. I mean, I would try to be honest,
Mm.
but you've got to say to yourself, well, maybe the government, just like you said, maybe you wouldn't have that person speaking at your university if they were denying the Holocaust or whatever it was, and doing it charismatically. And you've got to say to the government, well, maybe they would encourage, because they're so concerned about public safety, maybe it's not the end of the world to tell, you know, social media that you should be careful
So
to
now we're deciding though, right? And
exactly. And
that's so we're
but
in
I want to
that
point out it's not a black
situation.
and white issue.
Mhm.
I
No,
can
it's not.
understand. I can understand when they're charismatic people misinforming the public in a way that could kill them and could kill other people. Government has a responsibility at some point to take care of people's safety. Did they do it right? Probably not. But my point is just that
I
it's
guess
not
you
always
have
the
to
science that
balance.
matters.
No,
It's
it's
a
not.
lot
But
of
I
other
think you have
things.
to balance out, what do you think is going to do the most harm in this situation? And
Yeah.
I guess I will be on the side of it's done more harm to treat the population like they're stupid and to not be honest with them and to censor information. Um, yes, there'll be some harm, I think, that will come from lunatics talking about, insane things, and some people, proportion of people will listen to them, and when they have a megaphone, there is a greater danger there. But when you just censor them, I think ultimately you ruin trust in your own system instead of building up the trust in your own
Ultimately,
system.
censorship, as Richard Nixon learned, hiding information is never a good thing. In the end,
It
it
comes
always
out.
hurts. And the
Yeah.
worst thing, in some sense, is leading a distrust in science. Now, a distrust in scientists is different than a trust in science, but ultimately, science is self-correcting, and it's the best thing we have. And so, that you're right, the damage that's been done to vaccinations, to people who won't want to vaccinate their kids against
There's
measles now.
people for other, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And that's the thing. The consequences of that to me were so much worse than
and
some people listening
Yeah,
to Joe
yeah,
Rogan or
but it's easy in
whoever.
hindsight to say, it's hard. All I'm saying is that they're conflicting things that government has to deal with, and it's not always just the science that should make the decision. But I also
No,
believe that government shouldn't censor, and they should be honest. There must be a way to do it better,
but
but
people
it's
are
pretty
so
hard.
sick and tired of governments that think they know better, that lack transparency, that never apologize for getting anything wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
they as much as my
Have you ever known a government that's
no,
acted otherwise?
no, but wouldn't it be nice?
Wouldn't it
You
be
know,
nice?
I think people are aching for that. They want that so very much. And what I don't think it would do harm to a politician who did this. I think it would build trust with their population. And if they get something wrong and they admit it and they say, here are the steps, like even in a job interview, you go into a job interview and they ask you, well, tell us some of the times where you failed or whatever.
Yeah.
What they want to hear is you understanding when you failed and how you're now correcting course.
Exactly. In fact, my last book was called The Edge of Knowledge, but what in England was called The Known Unknowns. And what I said is the three most important words in science, but they should be for everyone, for teachers, parents, and particularly for politicians. Say, I don't know.
Hmm.
And then to do something and say, that didn't work. You know what? We tried, it didn't work. We're going to do something else. Wouldn't that be refreshing if we could just hear
Yeah.
that? It would
And
be
I
it'd be a
understand why a
different world.
government in the middle of a pandemic crisis doesn't want to say the words we don't know because we look to the government to protect us. A lot of what happened during the pandemic, a lot of the social issues we encountered were because of fear. But and so the government has to create the sense of, we've got this, guys. But I think you can still do it, even like a good leader does it, will say, this is what we're working on. Here's some details. So you understand what's going on, but not necessarily that you've solved the problem. Yes, it's maybe a little scarier to live in a world like that, but I think
Well,
it's
living in
going
a
to be
scary
better.
world is a reality, and what we try too much to do, and part of the problem of social justice is convince people they shouldn't live in a scary world. Well, it's always going to be scary, and
Yes.
and people turn to their parents in fearful times for certainty. They want to know, will I be okay? And parents will lie and say, okay, yes, because they're consoling. People turn to their God in times of fear, and people turn to the government in times of fear, like the pandemic, and they don't want to hear, I don't know. They don't want to hear that.
No.
And governments know what people want to hear.
And
And
it's true. I mean, it's sad that human nature is like that, where, it's why people with massive confidence often gain power because somebody who says, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure, I haven't decided, that's not going to be the person who gains the power, but actually, probably the person you'd rather have in power.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a person who can, yeah. But it's hard to know. It's hard to know. Yeah, it's a difficult question. And Winston Churchill, we'll get to him at the end of this, was a great leader, but because he could he could get people to resonate emotionally as well as intellectually, and that's part of being what gets elected. But I think this discussion we've had is so interesting, and I appreciate it. That it's I would almost be willing to end here because,
Hmm.
but I do want to go. I want to go to one more case because I found the
Sure.
person who impressed me the most, perhaps of everyone, what surprised me. I mean, there was James Damore. The
Okay.
story, and maybe I'll tell you why. And it's a story because the moral that you give there, it's such a generous one. Is put yourselves in the shoes of your critics. Here's a guy whose life is in principle destroyed, but he says, I can understand why people are doing that. And if people haven't heard of James Damore, why don't you just give the brief? All you do is say Google, and many people have heard of it. But why don't you give the
Yeah,
story?
it's the Google. Yeah, so James Damore was a Google employee who behind the infamous Google memo, where he basically talked about, the distinctions between men and women and why, they might perform differently in the tech space. And I think his intention was really to um, create an environment that would actually be more inclusive to, say, women being in the tech sector. But it was taken as, just saying that men and women have any kind of differences. It was very controversial at that time, and it probably still is.
Let's do him justice by reading what by quoting him as you do in the book, just so people know. I
Sure.
mean, the famous thing is people say, "Oh, this guy got fired because he said men are better engineers than women," or something like that, and everyone
Yeah.
goes, "Oh, well, he's just a misogynist," but that's far from the truth. And um,
I thought he was a misogynist at first, by the way,
yeah,
myself, when I
and me
heard the
too.
story.
When I first heard it, I agree, and that's why
I
reading
had an
this was so
argument with my brother and my dad about it.
well. I think for me, one of the most refreshing things is to discover I'm wrong. And it's lovely to read about this and guy, and that's why I think I want to talk about him. Um, he said he went to a program about diversity and they asked for feedback, so he gave him feedback. He said, I really thought that there were elements of the culture that were harming Google, so I wanted to improve it. One of the areas of the memo was to get the strongest attention was Demore's claim that men were better represented in tech than women due to biological differences, namely that, quote, more men may like coding because it requires systematizing, and, quote, women on average have more openness directed towards feelings and aesthetics rather than ideas. He added that women also tend to have more interest in people than things and thus prefer jobs in social and artistic areas, and that they are more prone to anxiety and thus on average may be more likely to perform well and maybe less likely to perform well in stressful tech jobs. He'd said this. He suggested that the workplace can be better adapted to these differences by making positions less stressful without having to engage in what's properly called reverse discrimination. So he argued, controversially, although there's many arguments that support it, that there are biological differences between men and women that affect their
Yeah.
behavior and affect their job choices. And he
It
suggested
doesn't
that
mean
if
it
that's the
affects every
case,
single person, but
yeah,
but
it may
it
not.
does.
And averages,
Yeah.
yeah, they're always, they're always not only exceptions, but it's statistical. But he argued that one should at least discuss it and see what you could do at the workplace that would might encourage more diversity by making it, in his case, less stressful. So his point was, um, he didn't want to favor people on the basis of identity. He wanted to look at the underlying reasons, which is an incredibly scientific approach. And
Yes, it
I was
is.
impressed by the fact that, yeah, he basically went to things by trying to look at the research and try and come up with an answer based on experimental empirical evidence. You say that somewhere here. And of course he got fired for it. He got fired for it, he got demonized for it. And what I found particularly, I guess, inspiring was in spite of that, he talks about the polarization. Um, and he says uh and he actually continues to have his girlfriend, which is nice. um but he argues that Google has problems because there isn't really much competition. They're printing money, therefore they don't have to try and look at what might be right but what looks good, because they don't doesn't really matter. But he actually argues that, well, no one likes to think of themselves as Hitler, but I can see how others would think of people like me as them. I mean, he he was fired. He looked for other work opportunities. He went, and this is the sad thing again. Um, he went to 20 interviews, I think you say, and
Yeah.
at every stage before they knew who he was, he passed the interview. The minute people knew who he was, he 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 um he didn't get the interview. Um, but he, as far as I can see, he's he says, I understand how people reacted the way they understand the way they did, and he continues to have fun playing and doing what he does. Did you find it shocking? I guess I found it really remarkable.
No, I did. I remember having the conversation with him and being quite surprised by him. In fact, I think I was almost trying to set him up in a positive way, and he kept sort of uh, self-reflecting a lot and looking and taking a lot of credit for like things that maybe he had done wrong, really understanding other people's perspectives. Because I think the way he was painted in the media was like this tech bro dude.
Yeah.
And I think most people never even took the time to read his memo to see what it was, although I'm sure it would have offended them anyways. But he was, one thing you have to realize about him, he's actually extremely autistic and
Yeah.
he's extremely shy.
Yeah.
So a lot of the way that he had expressed himself really came from then, not, I don't think, understanding this, like the social cues of things. And then when I talked to him, he was just really shy, really reflective. And yeah, really tried to put himself, that was the thing that stuck out to me, is like he really tried to put himself in the shoes of these people. And with me, I also did that and then moved on to this other phase. And I don't think he moved on to that other phase.
Yeah, he basically has tried to he said, you're right, he understands as an autistic person, he understands that he probably could do things differently, but he also does stay, and I'm really upfront. Um, one of Google's justifications for firing Demore was that through his words, he had contributed to creating a culture that was not, quote, work safe, particularly for females. So it was necessary to fire him to protect Google employees. And his
Yeah.
point, which is absolutely true, is a safe work environment doesn't imply that it must protect people from words, but rather the opposite. It's one necessary agreement is the feeling that you can speak your mind without being unfairly judged, and where your failures aren't seen as inherent flaws in yourself, rather just failures that can be learned from. And it's such a generous way of doing it. And it's also pointing out that this ridiculous safety aspect of protecting people who feel unsafe because of words makes them more unsafe because eventually everyone is afraid to say any words. So
Well, and
everyone
they don't
feels
have the
more unsafe.
resilience either.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
they
but
don't
they don't
have
have
the
his
resilience when they
resilience. And
encounter
but his
words.
point is that a safer environment is one in which people can speak their mind. And very few people would say that, and I found that remarkably
Mm.
insightful. And I would like to meet this guy because boy, he seems like a delightful fellow. He also is hopeful, which is amazing. Your last statement about him is, he says, "I don't think it needs to hit rock bottom to get better. I think things can get just incrementally improve. It's possible." What a nice and naive attitude, because once again, I think the statement that it's going to get worse before it gets better, as far as I can
I
see.
have a similar attitude, I suppose. You know, look, I think one of the natural things that happens to you when, especially when you experience, what people call as a
Yeah,
cancel culture, or what I call silencing culture,
yeah,
is that um you rage against the machine, essentially, right? And so you become very negative towards that part of
mm,
society that would engage in such a way. And I certainly found that to be true in terms of me being more like obsessive about things like that in the beginning. And as time has sort of progressed, I found myself seeing other people change, that people I respected and liked who were
yeah,
raging against the machine, and change in ways that I no longer liked them that much. And also seeing how, first of all, it does happen, and people get mad at me when I say it happens on all political sides, but it does,
it
because
does.
I've witnessed it happen. I've personally been, attacked by every side at this point.
Me too.
So, I mean, it does. So I try to focus, in my approach, I try to focus on behavior as opposed to ideology, because it's really about the behavior of humans. And I focus on the things that I want to protect, and I don't want to destroy people, and I want to bring them in. I think there is this kind of vilification of, oh, everyone who's woke is evil and all that kind of rhetoric. And first of all, you don't know. Okay, somebody puts, I don't know, pronouns in their bio. First of all, you don't know why they did that.
Yeah,
But also, it doesn't make them a bad person. It means that this is how they're thinking about things right now. And you ideally can have conversations, and people assume that you can't have conversations with all of these people, but that's not actually true. And my life experience has shown me that I have talked to people on all stripes, and And yeah, some people are going to be aggressive, not willing to change their minds. But if you don't come at them aggressively, if you come with them with like a level of understanding and explain how you feel, but also listen to them, they are, you see changes. And I have seen changes.
Yeah.
And I've seen changes in my environment where I bring up a lot of the topics that I'm concerned about. And I can have open conversations. I was afraid to mention my book in some of my circles, but I
Yeah.
did it. And I was surprised. I was so pleasantly surprised. People bought the book. Just somebody today posted how a photo of the book and how they liked it. And you don't know how people are going to
You
respond
don't know.
until you give them the opportunity to do so.
That's
And
right.
it's
And
been more positive. I even posted about the book in my Facebook group that I still have
oh,
technically.
really?
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I mean, but at the same time, you have to be prepared. And the last part of your
Yeah.
book and the beginning is last chapter conclusions, no apologies. You have to realize that if you didn't do anything wrong, as your argument is, and other people have argued, you don't apologize for it, and necessarily. And there's good advice, and I've learned this myself. Is that one of your advice was from a famous public figure? I don't know which one, but I've known,
Hmm.
experienced it myself. 2 week rule. People are furious. If you can just ignore the flurry for 2 weeks, if that's all it is. I mean, if they're going to lose your job, it's a different story. I'm not minimizing, but if you can deal with ignoring the crap for 2 weeks, then instead of feeling like a lot of people do, these sort of apologies that are done. You remember from the old Maoist apologies for being, and a lot of these things you see are just that. Oh, I'm so sorry, I hurt people. I didn't know I was hurting. But so your point is don't apologize. And I think, and I was surprised you didn't. I don't think you quote the famous quote, which is attributed to Winston Churchill, which a friend of mine told me first, and it actually goes back much further. Someone said it was oh, what's his name? Oh, anyway, I'll think about it in a second. One of my favorite authors. But anyway, nope, don't apologize, never explain. Never apologize, never explain. It's often attributed to Winston Churchill. And there's a second sentence for that, which is because um, your enemies won't accept your apology and they won't listen to your explanation. So don't bother. But I think the argument you give here for why, if you believe you're doing something right, not to apologize, which you do at the very end of which you explain as your own experience, why you didn't apologize, why well, obviously you admire the people who don't, and as you point out, you you you're quick to apologize when you do think you did something wrong,
Very quick.
but
I
not quick.
apologize for stepping on other people when people step on my foot.
Oh,
That's
yeah. Okay, there we go. But not for things you didn't do. Um,
no.
there's a great set of stories here, and I want to give you the last word, and I want to give you the last word by reading what you say. So I'll be really getting the last word, but it's the last paragraph of
Sneaky.
the book. Is that okay if I give you the
It's
last word that
okay.
way? So model the behavior and attitudes you'd like to see. This includes always considering whether you might be wrong, no matter the situation or debate. That's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of strength. But when you're not wrong, don't let fear silence you into submission. Always bear this in mind. When you've committed no wrongdoing, no one holds the authority to demand an apology from you, nor should you feel obliged to offer one. Stay firm, stay true. When your conscience is clear, don't be coerced or surrender your voice. Set it free and never apologize for this, which I think is good advice. Well, I enjoyed our discussion. I hope you did too. And I enjoyed the book, and I think it's important for people to see what I liked about it. Among other things, is it's important to put a face on this, see the effect on individuals, the many different ways of responding, and how hurtful behavior that you might otherwise think is righteous can really be. So I know you've had that experience. I've had too, and I've enjoyed that. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation.
I have enjoyed the conversation, but now that I've said that, I could have the last word.
Yes. Yes.
Technically.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, no, that
Take
was
it.
my last word. No, but I do
Okay.
think,
Okay.
wow, that was a joke, but
Yeah, no, it's a good joke, and I was going to say thank you, but then I'd have the last word. But
oh gosh darn it, we're gonna have to fight it out,
yeah,
and
I
then
think I
somebody's
think
gonna
we'll
owe
just.
somebody a
How about we
soda.
just? How about we just don't say anything, and I stop the recording, and you say
We
yes,
go
and
in
then you'll get the last
silence.
word.
Okay, let's do it. Yes.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.